Series Chronicles of the Soul War. Book 1. Velaria. The Beginning of the End. Prologue. Blood and Ash of Velaria. In those long-forgotten days, the world seemed different. Younger, somehow wondrous and magical, as if it would last forever. Magic was closer, more palpable, like warmth from a blazing hearth where some logs had already turned to crimson embers, while others merely blackened, veined with golden cracks. The memory of those times was not entrusted to books. It was absorbed into the very substance of the earth, into the scars on ancient fortress stones that held the scent of the steppe wind, and the sticky warmth of spilled blood, and into the gnarled rings of trees that stood in the forests before the birth of the current kings. Remembering a different sunlight, if you walked an old stone path, you could feel beneath your feet the invisible weight of bygone years, pressing each cobblestone into the damp, yielding earth. The continent of Velaria lay sprawled like a sleeping giant, and its slumber was peaceful. From north to south, in the north rose the dragon ranges, their peaks white with eternal snows, cold and blinding as a shroud, their rocks gray and stern like the faces of old warriors who had seen too much death. The air there was thin and seared the lungs like a knife's edge, and the wind howled through the ravines, unceasing from dawn till dusk, a song of oblivion. From the south, it was washed by the southern sea, vast and calm, the color of tarnished turquoise on a clear day, and the sun stands at its zenith. Its waters were warm, almost corporeal, and its waves lazily licked sandy beaches strewn with shells, whose crunch was audible under bare feet, and with dark seaweed. And over all this, from mountains to sea, stretched the hand of the empire of Almar, heavy and inexorable as fate. There was no place on the continent its decrees did not reach, sealed with the eagle and sun, the imprint pressed into wax with a dry, final snap, nor where the foot of its legionnaire did not tread, in armor polished to a mirror sheen, smelling of metal, leather, and the sweat of others. Along cobbled roads, straight as arrows, convoys moved day and night, grain shifting in carts, wine in barrels exuding a tart aroma, and fragrant, dark olive oil from the southern provinces to the north, while from the north to the south came ore, hard timber, and the soft, cold to the touch pelts of snow leopards. People called that time the Golden Age, and for many it was the truth. In the taverns of great cities, smelling of roast meat, acrid smoke, and sweat, a thick, almost tangible smell of life, any inhabitant of the empire could sit at the same table, darkened from countless spilled mugs of ale, and often a tall elf with hair the color of the midday sun, were fine, serene features, and eyes of old gold that saw what was hidden from mortals, sat beside a mighty dwarf. His beard was plaited in intricate braids wound with copper rings, and his hands, covered in old burns and scars, the chronicles of his craft, clasped a heavy mug of fired clay. And they did not argue over ancient grievances, nor did their eyes flash with old hatred smoldering deep within. Instead, they spoke of the price of steel, the whims of the imperial governor, caprices more dangerous than a dwarf's axe, or how the snow had fallen early this year in the cold foothills. They sealed agreements, bound not by oaths but by silent assent, firm as a dwarf's tread and durable as steel. It was a world the like of which had never been before, and, as the future would show, would never be again, contrary to the songs sung by minstrels in rich quarters, where words of valor and honor fly as lightly as dandelion fluff. The alliance of three peoples was not born in shining throne halls to the strains of harps, which sounded false even to the singer's own ears. It was forged in a different crucible, a stifling, cramped, and merciless crucible of shared calamity. It burned from souls everything but the simplest animal desire to survive. It emerged from the darkness, tempered in a single fire, like a steel blade forged from three different metals, each weeping and groaning under the hammer. But there was no other way. To understand this, one had to see Velaria as it was before the Empire. Not a single tapestry woven with golden threads on the loom of a mighty emperor, but a patchwork quilt hastily stitched from scraps of cloth. On the eastern plains, where the grass shimmered emerald green and rivers were so full of fish that the silver backs of salmon glimmered in the clear water like scattered coins, people tore at themselves. Their tribal chieftains, loud and greedy, with eyes swimming in mead and avarice, raised swords against their neighbors. One village would attack another not over a grand idea, but over pasture, a well poisoned, as it later turned out, by the instigator himself, or an insult delivered to someone's wife in a street brawl. They fought with fierce recklessness, their hoarse cries mingling with shrill horse whinnies, and the fertile earth grew sodden with blood. turning into sticky, slippery mud where boots sank and dead bodies lay forever. It was an endless, exhausting war, bringing no glory, only adding new scars to the old on the bodies of surviving men and a new, mute sorrow to the eyes of their women, gazing upon the ashes of their homes. To the northwest, beyond the capricious river Arundel, whose waters were cold even at the hottest noon, and beyond high, snow-capped mountain ridges, lay Lindorn. The air there was thick, almost viscous, with the scent of pine and damp earth decaying over centuries. Sunlight barely pierced the dense, nearly impenetrable canopy of ancient crowns, casting an eternal, greenish twilight on the ground. Here, in homes woven into the very trees so artfully that one couldn't tell an ash branch from a carved balcony from the ground, lived the elves. They moved soundlessly, their smooth gait like the quiet flow of an underground stream. Their faces were beautiful and cold as ivory statues holding age-old secrets. They gazed beyond the horizons at the smoke from human bonfires rising in ugly plumes, and in their deep, ancient eyes, one read not hatred but a weary, almost paternal sorrow, like that of a wise grandfather watching the foolish quarrels of small children. For them, who saw 10 generations of men come and go while one elf merely reached maturity, all these wars were the fuss of ants raising a clod of dirt. They guarded their wisdom and their magic, walled off from the world not only by a living hedge of ancient oaks, but by their own impenetrable indifference. And beneath the very roots of these forests, in the stone walls of the Dragon Range, in a world that knew no natural light, lay the halls of the dwarves. The great realm of Khazad-dûl did not strive upward toward the sun. It delved into the deep darkness, a labyrinth of endless halls, arched bridges spanning bottomless chasms, and countless mines. The air there hummed like a great beast from countless hammer blows on anvils, and was forever filled with the acrid smell of hot metal and stone dust settling on the tongue. Squat and muscular, with hands capable of shattering rock and crafting the finest patterns on steel, the dwarves trusted neither the elves with their quiet, irritating arrogance nor men with their inconstancy, like the wind. Their passion, their religion, and their immeasurable wealth was ore, especially the kind that shimmered in torchlight with a strange, living glow, magical crystals holding the ancient, untamed power of the earth itself. They dug deeper and deeper, listening only to the echo of their picks and the distant rumble of underground rivers, untroubled by what transpired on the surface. The calamity, as often happens in the bitterest of stories, came not from without, not from the grey western sea or the wild eastern lands. It rose from the very bowels, from those black, stuffy depths the dwarves had considered their undisputed domain, their cradle and their birthright. For centuries, they dug too greedily, too deep, blinded by the glitter of crystals, and finally, their picks, with a dry, ominous click, broke through a thick rock wall behind which gaped a void smelling of millennia-old mold, damp stone, and something sour and alien. There, in the gloom where no torchlight reached, and the very thought of light seemed a blasphemy, something awakened. Not a mountain spirit from tales told by old women at the hearth on long winter evenings, nor an ancient beast whose rage was blind and instinctual. No, this was an entire race, whose existence had become a nightmare given flesh. The arachnids. They had slept for ages in their damp, cramped caves, their slumber like a dreamless death. But now that sleep was shattered by the deafening, intrusive din of dwarven machinery, invading their eternal silence, and they awoke. Their rage was directed by the Queen Mother, a creature so vast and ancient it filled an entire subterranean hall. Her pale, pulsating body was like a living hill of flesh, eternally birthing new lives in agonizing spasms. These creatures were not primitive monsters, thinking only of sustenance. They thought as a single organism, cold, ruthless, and without mercy, a hive mind, where each individual was merely a finger on one hand, obedient and will-less, and the brain was the will of their mother, permeating their entire being. They knew no fear of death, no doubt, no pity, only a single, inexorable, glacier-like purpose, to annihilate all threats to their existence. They were numberless, more than the stars on a moonless night. They flowed through tunnels like a thick, shifting black river, and the sound of their movement was like the rustle of dried leaves mixed with the quiet, loathsome clicking of chitinous limbs on stone. Their chitinous carapaces, black as polished obsidian with a purplish, oily sheen, merged into one, creating the illusion of living, breathing metal. In total, absolute darkness, they glowed with a spectral light, and the patterns on their backs formed hypnotic, pulsating sigils that made eyes water, heads spin, and hearts clench with ancient, animal terror. But worse than this unearthly light were their limbs. 8 long, jointed legs, each ending not in a simple claw but in a sharp, razor-edged, curved blade of organic aloe, harder than the finest tempered dwarven steel. These blades did not merely cut, they pierced armor like thin skin, and flesh and bone like soft, melting butter. Each of these warriors, even the smallest, was a lethal weapon in the utter, pitiless dark. And now this weapon, dormant for ages, was aimed upward, toward the light the dwarves had so carelessly, so arrogantly, admitted into their realm. The first to bear the brunt, as was to be expected, were the dwarves. Their subterranean strongholds, those great halls whose colossal vaults were lost in darkness and whose columns, thick as towers, were carved from solid rock monoliths, had always been deemed impregnable. The mere thought of assaulting Khazad-Dûtol, the legendary bastion of the Iron Hand clan, was a blasphemy over which they would have only smirked in any feast hall. Its gates, several dwarves high, cast from solid adamant with bars as thick as tree trunks, were said to have withstood sieges by whole armies, protecting the citadel from fall. The elders, sipping strong ale, murmured that they would stand with the fortress until the end of times, until the stars fell from the sky. Khazad-Dûtol did not stand for several days, not weeks, not months, but days that flew by in a moment filled with mounting nightmare. First came a quiet, scratching grating, like sand falling on stone somewhere far off, but it was drowned out by the familiar, lulling whir of forge work, the clang of hammers, and the hum of machinery, sounds that were the dwarves' everyday music. Then the grating grew more insistent, closer, turning into a dry, repulsive hiss like red-hot metal plunged into water, then into a deafening, piercing shriek that froze the blood and raised gooseflesh. It was the sound of those very blades, grinding the unbreakable adamant like a carpenter playing softwood, with the difference that this work gave off a smell of burning and something acrid, poisonous. And by the time the gates, the greatest symbol of the power and impregnability of the entire dwarven people, fell with a dull, death-rattle groan, opening a black maw of a tunnel leading deeper from the citadel into the dwarven realm, there were almost no dwarves left in Khazad-Dûtol. There stood darkness itself, living, hungry, and pitiless, smelling of mold and dead earth. This was no siege, there was no measured, deafening thud of rams against fortified gates, no ladders studded with climbing figures, no whistle of arrows. The enemy did not come through the gates. They scorned such concepts, these conventions devised by creatures living in a world of walls and doors, who believed stone could protect. They poured from within, like black, salt water, slowly and inexorably breaching a clay dam. From narrow, forgotten ventilation shafts, where only the whisper of a draft was heard, from drainage tunnels carrying waste, from the oldest, abandoned workings the dwarves in their folly or pride had deemed unnecessary, sealing them with stone slabs, but not destroying them, flowed a black, chitinous sea. They did not march in ranks, they flowed along walls and ceilings, defying the very laws of gravity. Their living, breathing darkness extinguished torchlight even before the forward sentries, sensing something amiss, could raise the alarm. Khazad-Dûtol, the citadel that had endured for ages, did not fall in days. It was drowned in that black, soundless tide in moments. The streets, where for centuries the rhythmic ring of hammers on hot metal and loud, lively arguments about ore quality and ale strength had echoed, were now filled with a different, alien sounded dry, rustling, ceaseless grating of chitin on stone polished to a mirror sheen. Those who miraculously escaped a mere handful, pitiful crumbs of an entire people, fled upward into the blinding, now foreign world of the sun, not merely with fear in their eyes. They carried on their once proud beards, in the folds of their smoke and sweat-soaked cloaks, the dust of their native stone mixed with sticky, disgustingly tactile webbing that stretched like saliva and seemed alive. Their stories, bursting forth in broken fragments, voices trembling, eyes empty, were not of a lost battle, where one could count losses and blame fate or a commander. They were of something worse, beyond martial logic, an all-consuming darkness that did not simply kill, but methodically, without malice, without haste, and without any interest in plunder, devoured their very heritage, their history carved in stone. They saw how the shimmering, hypnotic patterns on the creatures' backs desecrated the majestic visages of ancient kings, gazing from walls with serene wisdom, how their sacred forges, where the finest steel in all Velaria had been smithed for centuries, legends born from its ring, were covered in sticky, gray webs. They fled carrying not merely the memory of defeat, but the cold, soul-searing realization as scalding as red-hot iron that their world, the world of stone and steel, deep and reliable, was to this darkness merely soft, yielding soul to be plowed and sown with its own rot. And when the fortress gates, separating it from the rest of the underworld, fell, the arachnids poured forth, consuming the dwarven realm, then upward, into the world of light and fresh air. Like pus from a lanced abscess finally reaching the skin's surface, they crawled from cracks in cliffs, from caves, from the narrowest, most inconspicuous fissures in the earth. And the daylight, falling on their chitinous carapaces for the first time in millennia, seemed not to gladden but only to anger them, making them move faster and more aggressively. Their multiple eyes weeping from the unfamiliar brightness, but it did not stop them. And before the world of men could be ensnared, the darkness reached Lindor, the once inviolable, slumber magic veiled forests of the elves, where every leaf seemed steeped in ancient power and the air hummed with invisible life, met the enemy with an alert whisper of leaves and a growing, anxious hum of all living things. That the breath of the arachnids, creeping into the thicket, was foul. It carried not a poison that could be neutralized, but something worse, absolute, bottomless alienness, a void against which life itself was powerless. Great trees, whose mighty trunks remembered the world's dawn and under whose shade the first alliances were made, began to wither from the roots as if drunk dry from within. Their sap sucked out, their bark, once hard and patterned, became covered in hideous, pulsating growths. Leaves blackened and fell within an hour, turning not into life-giving dust for new shoots, but into acrid, gray, lifeless powder. The air, once suffused with a delicate scent of pine, wild honey, and night-blooming flowers, now reeked of rot and a strange bitterness that made throats itch and eyes water. The elves, whose magic was like a complex, beautiful song woven with the very soul of the forest, found themselves powerless, and this realization was heavier than any physical wound. Their spells, capable of quelling storms, healing wounds, or calling forth a spring, shattered against the silent, organic foreignness of the arachnids like waves against a submerged reef. Arrows, loosed by sure hands, found their marks, but the struck spiders, uttering no sound, slowed not their advance, as if unaware of wounds, as if pain were an unfamiliar concept. Their nature, their very essence, was so alien that the ancient elven magic, permeating all creation, simply found nothing akin within them, no thread to seize, no cord to sever. This was not a battle, but a slow, inexorable fading, a transformation of the living into the dead. And the elves, who for centuries had gazed upon the mortal world with serene, almost paternal sorrow, knew for the first time real, animal, all-consuming terror, the terror of the total and absolute end of all they knew and loved, an end advancing without wrath or clamor, in a deadening, silent stillness. Then the gray, endlessly shifting hordes, like her suddenly animated and crawling, fell upon the fracture, strife-ridden human kingdoms, and what they brought with them made the hardiest warriors who had looked death in the face go gray with terror in mere hours. All the cruelty of their endless wars raged for cattle, villages burned to the ground. Chieftains' duels over phantom honor suddenly seemed childish, insignificant, almost innocent bickering. This was not a battle where valor could be shown, with tactics, flanks, and rear. This was a deluge, a plague, a natural disaster clothed in form and will. The arachnids took no prisoners, looted not for gold or ornaments, sought not to capture a throne or enforce fealty. They merely cleansed the territory, methodically, soundlessly, and with monstrous efficiency, leaving behind not smoldering ruins, but lifeless void, covered in a sticky gray film, amidst which gleamed bones picked clean to the last tendon, shining with a ghastly purity in the sun. It became clear this was no invasion measurable by number of swords or length of spears, to be met with a shield wall or a cloud of arrows, to be stopped by cold steel and hot courage. What transpired at the walls of Belrhat was an awakening, the awakening of an entire, unknown, and hostile underworld that had slept beneath their feet all this time, while their short, bustling lives seethed on the surface. And this world was ruled by a single, pitiless will, that of the Queen Mother. And so, faced with this breathing, shifting abyss, they all gathered, not merely an army assembled for battle, but the last lie, a living, breathing wall of flesh, steel, and unyielding will. Behind them lay all that still mattered in this world, the smoky, bread-scented homes of their towns, cradles with peacefully snuffling infants, the plaintive songs of elders by hearths, the faded, wine-worn banners of their forefathers, all the memory and all the future of their peoples, all their short and long history. They stood shoulder to shoulder, peering into the advancing, unnaturally dense twilight, and knew there was nowhere to retreat, that to retreat meant to lose everything. Along the entire defensive line, where the earth still lay firm underfoot, not heaving or cracking, stood men, their armor, still gleaming with polished steel, was now covered in road dust and reflected the crimson, sinister glimmer of the sun setting behind clouds, as if already spattered with blood. Their long, familiar swords, faithful companions of countless internecine clashes, were now raised in a single, ragged but resolute line, their serrated blades like veins of living fire against the darkening, starless sky. In human eyes, weary and full of anxiety, was not blind fury, but the stern, hard-won resolve of those defending their threshold, their hearths, and the graves of their ancestors. Behind them, in the center, as if the very embodiment of nature, rose the elves. Their gilded, chased armor did not sit as a heavy burden but fitted their slender forms, light and strong as the bark of a young oak, and just as fair. They did not whisper, bustle, or adjust weapons. Their long, elegant, deadly bows of supple ash were drawn, and in each quiver lay arrows fletched with the wing of the snowy polar bird, their tips gleaming with the cold light. Their gazes, usually fixed on the depths of ages, were now riveted to the approaching, churning darkness with cold, almost detached concentration. Beside the men, like an outcropping of the mountain itself, stood the dwarves, heavy and immovable. They were unmistakable. Their armor was not for beauty or lightness. These were mobile fortresses of tempered, dark metal, plates a grown man's finger thick, ringing dully with each movement like a beginning landslide. Their huge, rectangular shields, edged with copper, could lock into a solid, impenetrable wall behind, which a whole squad could shelter. And in their hands rested the famous battle axes, not those for chopping wood, but grim, massive cleavers, whose broad, honed blades had been forged for centuries in the fires of the deepest, most sacred forges, where dwarven masters imbued the steel not only with the force of mountain pressure, but with all their age-old, implacable hatred of the dark. They stood, legs wide, rooted to the earth, and their grim, oppressive silence was more eloquent than any battle cry. And when the first ranks of arachnids, without a cry, without formation, without a single sound, crashed upon the defenders, it was not an advance, it was an avalanche, a living, shifting tide of chitin that shattered against the erected steel wall of the alliance. With a deafening, dry roar, the air, mere moments before filled with tense, ringing silence, exploded in a cacophony of death. A deafening, all-consuming din swallowed all the sounds of the world. The high, piercing shriek of steel grating on chitin, the dull, bony crack of breaking carapaces, the muffled, wet crunch as a heavy dwarven axe smashed a slippery back. Through this hellish, unceasing noise broke human cries, hoarse battle shouts merging into one long, desperate moan, and short, choked-off gasps as arachnids found a gap in armor or an exposed throat. Human swords, those very ones that had proudly reflected the crimson sunset just before, now rose and fell in a convulsive, lethal, exhausting rhythm. This was no longer combat, no duel, but grueling, mind-numbing labor, heavy and bloody as threshing with flails. Each blow demanded all strength, all body weight thrown into shoulder and back, making muscles burn with fire. Steel did not cut it ground, with difficulty and a screech, into slippery, incredibly hard carapaces, often bouncing off the convex, streamlined backs. Vulnerabilities were found only in narrow, barely noticeable crevices between the segmented joints of the limbs, at their very bases, in the tiny, dead beads of multiple eyes. And to strike them, a warrior had to let the creature close, feeling its sour, alien breath on his face, seeing his own distorted reflection inches away in the chitinous armor. This was a battle of attrition, where the price of each severed limb or crushed body was measured in liters of spilled sweat and blood. The dwarves stood. They did not advance with furious cries, nor did they retreat a step. They were that unyielding rock against which the first, fiercest wave of the tide broke. Their famous great shields locked into a single, serrated, breathing wall behind which one could shelter, if not a whole city, then certainly the last hope of all living things. From behind this steel, impenetrable barrier, grim death was born. Dwarven battle axes, famed throughout the world for their untamable might, fell upon the foe not with an elegant whistle, but with a deafening, dull, bony crash like an ancient oak split by lightning. They did not cut, they crushed, without subtlety, tearing chitin to shreds, pulping innards, and hurling mutilated, formless bodies back into the advancing, faceless dark, but with each fallen arachnid, with each creature ripped asunder so that sticky, purple fluid gushed out. 2, even 3 new ones crawled from the thick, living blackness to take its place. They clamber over the bodies of their fallen kin, using them as a living, shifting ledge. Their dead, cooling brethren were mere rubble, cobblestones on the path to the summit, to the light they wished to extinguish. Their black, polished dash to dash a dash sinister dash oe dash sheen limbs, not claws, but sharp, razor-edged, curved blades of organic aloe, harder than the finest tempered dwarven steel, gleamed in the bloody, smoky haze of battle like cold, lifeless stars in hell. And these blades, knowing neither fatigue nor doubt, began their unhurried, methodical work. They did not breach armor with a mighty blow. They sought crevices, as water seeks a crack in rock, a thin, precise thrust into the armpit where steel plates meet, leaving a vulnerable strip of skin and tendon, a lightning jab into a narrow visor slit, behind which life beats a glancing, almost weightless strike at the unprotected back of a knee, to fell the strongest giant. Methodically, without haste and without a single sound, they dismantled the strongest, most masterful armor piece by piece, like butchers dismembering a carcass. With the same indifference, the elven archers seemed to hold sway over the battlefield. From their elevated positions, with a dreadful view of the raging sea of darkness, fell a whizzing, lethal rain, relentless in its precision. Each sturdy arrow, loosed from bows taut as the strings of fate, found its single, predetermined target, a hair-thin gap in the joint of a chitinous leg, a tiny, almost invisible crevice at the base of a skull, a shiny, black pearl bead of a complex faceted eye. They struck without fail, and with each of their hits, another creature would falter, as if pausing in thought for an instant, and tumble from that living, freezing wall of arachnids, becoming another mound underfoot. But even this flawless, edge-honed arc could not break the simple, soulless arithmetic of this war. For each fallen, transfixed creature, several new ones crawled from the gaping, smoking depths. Their waves came without cease, without pause for regrouping, without relief for weary warriors. Like an ocean that had overflowed its banks, resolved to swallow all land at once, the young archer, Sylvan, whose face had not yet lost its youthful softness and spirit, loosed arrow after arrow, his movements practiced and swift as a hummingbird's heartbeat. At first, he felt only the taut, dry snap of the bowstring and the light, familiar jolt in his shoulder. Then a hot, growing rawness appeared in his fingers gripping the string, as if his skin were being rubbed with sandpaper. The stream of arrows did not slacken, was just as lethal, but now each shot echoed in his lacerated hand with a sharp, burning pain. He watched as his long, skilled fingers, which had once played silver strings in the gardens of Lindorn, were ground to a bloody, sticky pulp by the coarse, sturdy fibers of the bowstring. But he did not stop, for stopping meant death. His hand, now almost numb, reached by trained habit for another arrow and found only emptiness. His quiver was empty. He looked down at the endless, raging sea of chitin rising to his very feet, and quietly, almost reverently, laid his elegant bow upon the ground, sodden with mud and blood. He uttered no word, made no moan, only drawing a pair of curved, swallowing elven daggers from his belt, their blades gleaming in the fading, crimson light like two thin, cold lunar crescents. He stepped forward to meet the tie, to face it hand to hand, in a last, desperate dance. Prince Alan, fighting in the very first, most hellish ranks where steel met chitin, in a furious, insane dance of death, saw not just a line collapsing, but his entire world, all his notions of valor and honor, crumbling. He saw not the general, chaotic picture of battle, but individual scenes snatched by a fevered gaze, each stabbing his heart sharper and more painfully than any enemy blade. He saw the young legionary Lorik, the very one who, at dawn, had smiled shyly and brightly, remembering his betrothed left in a distant, quiet castle in the capital. Lorik did not hold the line by heroic effort or break enemy ranks with a desperate charge. He simply saw a wounded young warrior, just a bow, helplessly tripping over a gutted corpse and falling into the mire. And he stepped forward, just stepped forward, putting his body, his life, in the path of a hail of black, shining blades. A dozen of the sharp steel tips pierced him, emerging from his chest in all directions like porcupine quills. He fell, heavily and soundlessly, pinning to the earth the frail body he had hoped to save. And they lay together in a last, terrible embrace. Then his gaze, blurred with sweat and pain, fell upon the old dwarf Balin, Alan remembered his gruff, booming laughter during the war council and his dense, fern-thick beard plaited in intricate braids with steel rings woven in, chimming with each movement. Now that very beard was matted with clotted blood and lumps of sticky, disgusting filth. Dallin stood, cut off from his kin, his back to a pile of his own clan's bodies, stacked like firewood for a giant pyre. His axe, which he had not released from his calloused hands for decades, was blunted on the unyielding chitin, but still rose and fell with the measured, weary groan of an old man performing his last labor. He did not shout, did not call upon the gods. He simply stood and hewed, slowly and methodically, until the wave of darkness engulfed him whole like a sea abyss. When it receded, he still stood, immobile and majestic, surrounded by a heap of mutilated bodies, like an old, dead oak refusing to fall even after the fiercest storm. And last he saw the elf maiden Erin. She stood on a slight rise, and her silver, chased armor was no longer radiant but spattered with black, foul-smelling slime. She continued to shoot, and her movements, despite the hell around, remained precise and unerring. Even when enemy ranks drew so close she could see her distorted reflection. In their chitinous carapaces, Alan saw a thin, poisoned blade, flashing like a serpent's fang, dart from the sickening dark. It entered her chest just below the collarbone with a quiet, wet, sucking sound that Alan heard through all the din of battle. Erin shuddered, and a shadow of sharp, living pain for the first time twisted her ever-impassive, beautiful, morning-like face. She looked slowly at the arrow shaft in her trembling hand, then forward, at the next target materializing in the swirling haze, and loosed it. Another, and another. She continued to shoot, standing knee-deep in corpses, until her fingers unclenched of their own accord and the elven bow fell with a quiet thud onto the bloody, trampled earth. And then, when it seemed the battle's fury could reach no greater intensity, that the cup of suffering overflowed from the deepest, yawning chasms, from which echo only the death rattles and the rustle of countless legs, rose she. First the earth shuddered with new, unprecedented force, making the steadiest warriors stumble and fall, stones tumbling from fortress walls. The air, already thick with the sweetish smell of blood, acrid sweat, and burning, filled with a heavy, sweet-rotten stench of decay that made eyes water, stomachs clench, and breath catch. And then, blotting out the crimson, smoke-filled sky, from a huge fissure, slowly and inexorably, crawled the Queen Mother. Her body, pale as a corpse and pulsating like a living abscess, was the size of an entire fortress tower. It was not covered in the shining chitin of her children, only thin, translucent, bluish skin under which one could guess the convulsive movement of countless lives she gestated and carried within. She eclipsed the last, pitiful rays of the sun, casting a giant, shifting shadow over the battlefield, swallowing the last hopes. Her 8 limbs, not thin and jointed but thick, gnarled like century-old oak trunks, ended not in mere blades. These were whole masses, chunks of the same darkest aloe, but more massive, sharper, and deadlier than those of her simple warriors. She did not strike in the usual sense. She swept them through the space before her, like a giant reaper with a scythe. One unhurried swing, and a dozen warriors, men in steel plate, and dwarves in their unbreakable armor vanished, sliced into neat pieces of flesh and metal along with their shields and armor. This was not battle, it was harvest, and its yield was bloody. Through the ranks of the exhausted defenders ran something worse than simple fear, a deep, soul-chilling despair. It ran like a visible tremor, a cold, deathly wind through a field of wheat, denting the stalks. Even the bravest, those who had not flinched before countless hordes, faltered now. They gazed upon this embodiment of ancient, impersonal, all-consuming horror, and their courage, so bright and human, suddenly seemed a negligible, flickering spark before eternal, indifferent darkness. It was at this moment, when the defenders wavered and was ready to turn to flight, that King Edward, fighting alongside his warriors, saw the gigantic, cold shadow of the Queen Mother creeping toward the very heart of his thinning lines. He saw the last fire dying in his men's eyes, and in this all-consuming gloom, there was no room for subtle strategy or smoldering hope. Only one thing remained: to meet the inevitable end with weapons in hand, as befitted a warrior. He raised high his long, royal sword, notched and dull from countless blows, and turned to the remnants of his royal guard. Their one shining armor was scratched, dented, covered in blood and slime. Their ermine cloaks were torn to shreds, but they still stood around him, awaiting his last command. ready to follow him into the very inferno. For Velaria burst from him, a hoarse, ragged cry containing more furious despair than hope, more wrath at an unjust fate than faith in victory. But this lone cry, like the first spark, fell into the powder keg of universal resolve. It was taken up, first by dozens of weary throats, then hundreds, then thousands, merging into one deafening roar. It was no longer a battle cry, but a last, collective, desperate howl of all living things before the face of oblivion. And this howl, born in the abyss of despair, moved them from their place, carrying them into a final, suicidal charge. Beside Edward, matching him in fury, fought Thormund. The air of the fallen dwarf king seemed to have absorbed all the rage, all the grief, and all the defiance of his people. His two-handed axe thunderclap, not a mere piece of tempered metal, but an ancestral legacy, whose mystical weight was felt by the very earth no longer hew. It shattered, crushed, ground to dust. Each swing described a wide, crushing arc, mowing down whole groups of arachnids, scattering around it shards of chitin and fountains of black, stinking fluid. He was not a warrior, but an embodied storm, a living core of desperate resistance, and his heavy, rasping breath merged with the roar of the approaching tempest and the moans of the dying. The high priest Calendal, whose flawless face had, until the last moment, held the seal of eternal, unruffled youth, watched as the last, thin line of men and dwarves prepared to perish, to be swept away by the colossal, pitiless shadow of the Queen Mother. He saw that one more moment, and all would be lost irrevocably. And then he understood the hour had come to pay the last, most precious tribute to this dying world. He raised his hand, and to him, pushing through the chaos and crush, came the last surviving elven priests. They were few, their white robes were torn and soiled, their eyes, once clear, were now filled with mortal weariness and sorrow. They gathered around him, forming a fragile, trembling circle amidst the general slaughter, and clasped hands like children. There were no loud incantations, fiery words, or blinding flashes, only a quiet, monotonous, funereal chant in a tongue as ancient as the world itself, whose words had been forgotten before the birth of the first men. And then over the battlefield, over this pit full of blood, entrails, and despair, a glow flared. It was like neither torchlight nor lightning. It was as if the sun itself, forgotten behind a dense veil of smoke and darkness, had suddenly descended to earth to cast one last, farewell glance upon its dying creation. The light was dazzlingly white, pure, almost sterile, and so painful one wanted to shut one's eyes. For a moment it stunned the arachnids, their glowing patterns dimmed, their swift, coordinated movements slowed, as if they had met an invisible, impassable wall. For the defenders, this unearthly light was a gulp of icy, life-giving water in the infernal furnace. The wounded, momentarily forgetting their pain, raised their heads, perplexity flickering in their eyes. Warriors, raising weapons for a final blow, gained a precious second to catch their breath and gather strength. But anyone near that fragile circle of priests saw the true, horrifying price of this miracle. Calendal, standing at its center, aged before their eyes, as if time, which he had long deceived, fell upon him from all sides at once. His long, silver hair, seeming woven from moonlight itself, began to dull, turn gray, and fade, as if touched by mortal frost. His smooth, unwrinkled skin, which had held the youth of many human centuries, became a network of deep wrinkles like dry, cracked clay. He straightened to his full height, pouring into the spell all his life force, giving away with every moment for this brief, bought respiratures, decades, whole layers of his immortality. This was not magic in the usual sense. It was a voluntary, slow self-annihilation, an act of final sacrifice for the sake of a few desperate breaths of hope, for those whose lives were but a moment anyway. Their final clash with the Queen Mother began, and it was no longer battle in the usual sense, but the epilogue of a great, bloody tragedy, where each blow was a last, desperate line, and each fall a final, thunderous chord echoing into the coming silence of eternity. Thormund, heir to the yonder mountain kingdom, fell first, as befits a warrior leading the charge. He did not seek death, but neither did he shrink from it, standing firmer than granite. 3 black, polished blades, long and sharp as poisoned needles, pierced his mighty, stocky torso, passing through layers of tempered steel and tough, oak-like flesh. But even falling, drenching the earth with his dark, thick blood, he made a last, reflexive movement. His thunderclap, obeying the inertia of purest despair, described a short, crushing arc and sank into the base of one of the creature's jointed, oak-like limbs. There was a deafening, dry crack, like rock splitting, and pale, gelatinous flesh tore open, pouring streams of corrosive, smoking black fluid onto the earth. It was not a mortal wound for such a colossus, but the first truly deep, grievous injury, making the monstrous body shudder with unfamiliar, piercing pain. Kalendal, the high priest, who had given all his many thousand-year, unhurried existence for a handful of precious seconds of hope, spoke no more. His magic, having drained his life to the last drop, vanished like a drying spring. He did not fall, he collapsed, like an ancient ash tree felled by a storm, bereft of roots. His body, a vessel for unfathomable, ancient force moments before, touched the bloodied, trampled earth and went limp, as if all land life had been extracted at once. Silence, once filled with the chanting, now thickened into a ringing void. No movement, no breath, only silent witness to what had been. Prince Alan stood shoulder to shoulder with his father, his king, and his breath was even, as befitted a warrior, though the air around was thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of blood. He saw how King Edward fought, this old lion whose strength was already ebbing like sand from broken hourglasses, but whose will stood unshaken like a rock in a raging sea. And then he saw it, one of the Queen Mother's blades, swift, precise, and pitiless as a serpent's tongue, flashed in the swirling haze of battle. It sped toward the king's back at the fatal moment when Edward, gathering the remnants of his mighty frame, was fending off a fierce assault from the other side. Turning almost his back to his son, there was no thought, only an exhalation, and one crushing movement, learned to automatizo, over years of grueling training in the castle yard, where every muscle burned with fire and steel rang on steel under the gaze of stern instructors. Now this movement was ruled by a simple, clear, and inexorable truth of a son's duty. He stepped forward, putting his young body, still full of life and unspent hopes, in the path of the lethal blow. The sharp, cold blade entered his chest easily, almost soundlessly, with a quiet whisper of torn fabric and a slight grating as it pierced the steel breastplate and the fragile, warm flesh beneath. He did not cry out, there was no time, no air in his lungs for a cry, only a short, wet exhalation escaped his lips, and his still clear gaze met his father's shocked, suddenly youthfully horrified stare. And in that gaze was no fear of the encroaching darkness, already spreading like a soft black velvet pall. There was a strange, pure, almost luminous pride, the kind that sometimes shines in a child's eyes after completing a difficult task. He had done what he had to do. The prince had protected his king. The son had saved his father. And that, in his receding, calming heart, was completely enough. King Edward, the old warrior whose body remembered dozens of battles and whose soul the weight of decades of rule, continued to stand. He stood, though his once magnificent armor, which had shone at feasts and inspired on battlefields, was now marred by deep dents and long scratches, exposing the bloodied, exhausted body beneath a body now humming with one continuous, relentless pain. He stood, though his faithful longsword, which had served him faithfully for years, the very one received from his father's hands, broken half with a sad, high ring, and he clutched in his numb, stiff hand only a short, useless fragment with a jagged edge. He stood, though his family's shield, a wooden relic banded with steel, passed through generations, was split into two unequal parts, leaving only a heavy, flesh-biting iron strap pressing on the bones of his almost insensate arm. He saw the colossal limb of the Queen Mother, more like the branch of an ancient, sinister tree, with a blade of darkest aloe that absorbed rather than reflected light, slowly, with almost ritual force, draw back for a last, finishing blow. A blow that would carry him into oblivion like wind sweeps a dried leaf. And in this moment, when time slowed to a crawling, viscous speed, his gaze, blurred with pain and fatigue, sliding over the bloodied earth strewn with wreckage and bodies, fell upon Thormund's body, whose battle rage had been fiercer than a winter storm. His lifeless hand was still clenched in a fist, as if even death could not unclench those mighty fingers. And nearby, in the grass dark with blood and dust, lay Thunderclap, his two-handed axe forged of dark dwarven steel alloy with mithril. Its blade, broad and flawless, even now in the gloom of the approaching end, held a cold, inner light. It lay there, just 2 steps away, as if waiting for the last throw, the last choice, the last movement of which the old king's exhausted body was capable. Before the darkness caught him too, without thinking, driven by a last, desperate surge of will, Edward lunged forward, stumbling over lifeless bodies. His fingers, slippery with his own and others' blood and sticky sweat, grasped with difficulty the massive, dwarven hand-shaped haft of the axe. It was incredibly, unnaturally heavy, alien, forged for inhuman strength. In a final surge, with a hoarse, primitive groan torn from the depths of his tormented body. Staggering, he brought the axe down at the very moment the Queen Mother once again spewed accumulated filth from her horrible maw, and its point drove true into the creature's bulging, shimmering eye. The blow was terrible in its force. The axe did not merely wound it shattered, destroy, obliterated. The blade pierced thick chitinous armor, cartilage, and bone, sinking into the gelatinous flesh of the skull with a dull, juicy, visceral sound. The Queen Mother, for the first time in this endless battle, made a sound not a scream, but a deafening, low-frequency, vibrating shriek of purest rage and unbearable pain, making the very air shudder and the ground tremble underfoot. That her swing, begun before, could not be cancelled. The answering, almost reflexive stroke of the blade, though weakened by agony, still reached its mark, when the morning sun, pale, cold, and indifferent, finally rose over the ravaged battlefield. Its first feeble rays illuminated what no longer resembled familiar earth. It was a patchwork, monstrous carpet stitched from millions of deaths. Countless arachnid bodies blanketed the ground in a thick layer of chitin and congealed, sticky black slime, stirring in the morning breeze. That the price paid for this was unimaginably horrible. Of the hundreds of thousands of defenders, men, elves, and dwarves who had stood here as one wall just yesterday, very few remained alive. Where their line had been lay a single heap of mangled steel, broken shields, and bodies, mixed so tightly and chaotically one could no longer tell where one warrior ended and another began, where scarlet human blood mingled with dark dwarven and light elven. And at the center of this great, silent cemetery, at the very foot of the colossal, cooling corpse of the Queen Mother, knelt the body of King Edward. He had not fallen, had not been laid low, he was frozen in his last, greatest effort. His hands, stiffened in death, still gripped the haft of thunderclap with a dead man's grasp. The axe buried deep, up to the shaft, in the creature's shattered head. His face, spattered with mud, soot, and clotted blood, was turned not skyward in plea or reproach, but toward where the few, miraculously surviving defenders had gathered. Broken, wounded men, elves with extinguished, empty gazes, and dwarves who had bowed their heads in silent wrath. And on his frozen, whitened features was not the triumph of a victor, nor the terror of death, only a heavy, boundless, all-consuming weary calm, such as comes after long, back-breaking labor. And that silent, marble-carved expression seemed to say to those who survived, to those who must carry the memory of this day through coming ages, "Look, we did it. We held. Now it is your turn to remember and to build." This victory was not celebrated in the squares. No victory bells rang, no sour wine flowed in rivers, no songs of praise were sung at feasts. It was mourned, with the quiet, inconsolable sobs of women crawling among mountains of corpses in futile search for husbands and sons, with the deep, stony, wordless silence of dwarves who had lost entire clans, entire dynasties. In that meat grinder, with the quiet, detached, yet no less profound sorrow of the elves, whose immortal souls had for the first time known the weight of such mass, irreplaceable loss. The air was thick and sweet with the smell of blood, death, and the acrid smoke of smoldering chitinous carapaces. But it was here, on this scorched, suffering-soaked earth littered with common wreckage, in the crucible of shared grief, that something new, fragile, and unyielding was born. From the ashes of great tragedy, like the first fragile shoot breaking through burnt wasteland, the empire of Almar began its long and difficult journey. Its foundation was not conquest or thirst for power, but shared, voluntary sacrifice. Its cement, binding it for ages, was blood, human, dwarven, and elven mingled into a single soil, gathering on the blood-drenched, steel-littered field before the walls of Belrat. Amidst the acrid smoke of smoldering bodies and the muffled moans of the dying, the survivors, men in shattered, mangled armor, elves with extinguished, inward-turned gazes, and dwarves kneeling silently by their chieftains' bodies raised their eyes to the only surviving brother of King Edward, an old warrior named Marion, upon whose stooped but still sturdy shoulders now rested the unbearable burden of all the future. He, bearing his notch, brown-stained sword and raising it to the sky, began to speak, and his voice, hoarse from smoke, tears, and sorrow, was taken up by thousands of weary throats, turning into a single, powerful tocsin echoing over the field of death, over the heaps of bodies and ruins. "Hear me, children of Velaria. Hearken to the voice of the blood spilled here in rivers and soaked into this earth. before the eyes of fallen kings, in the face of the vanquished foe, in the shadow of our cities and forests. We, the survivors, whose hearts are gutted by grief, swear this oath, not on parchment, for it will decay, not on stone, for it will crack, but on our hearts, which will beat remembering this hour, and on the hearts of our children, and our children's children, until our line is no more. We swear by the blood of my brother, Edward, who fell as a warrior, and of all defenders who gave their lives. We swear by the wisdom of Calendal and all fallen children of the forest, whose magic die in this fight. We swear by the fury of Thormund and all sons and daughters of the mountains, who fell with axe in hand, yielding not an inch. Henceforth and forevermore, there shall be among us no men, no elves, no dwarves. There is but one people, the people of Almar, the people of Velaria, bound by common blood and common fate. We swear that never again shall our blades be drawn against a brother. Our enmity, our rage shall be turned only upon the outer darkness that dares encroach upon our common home, our common hearth. We swear to share bread in times of hunger, knowledge in times of ignorance, strength in times of weakness. Let the hands that but hours ago held sword and axe together take up plough and hammer, to rebuild what we nearly lost forever. We swear to keep this memory, this wand upon our common soul, the memory of the price, the unimaginable price we paid for the right simply to breathe this air and walk this earth. And woe to him, be he elf, dwarf, or man, who forgets this price and dares trample this oath for old hatred or new greed. Let him be an outcast to the living and a curse to the dead who lie here, gazing upon us with empty sockets. And let it be, that while our hearts still beat, while these walls still stand, even if they must be rebuilt from these very stones, we are one, and everyone who survived that hell, who felt the cold breath of non-being on their face, carried within from that day forward not only physical scars, but this knowledge, this burden. It was heavier than the strongest dwarven armor, sharper than the keenest elven blade. They had to live, not merely breathe and eat, dragging out a miserable existence, but live, build, race, create. Remember, for those who remained lying in the cold, silent shadow of Belrat's walls, their own lives no longer belonged wholly to them. They became a debt, an unpayable debt to the fallen, a bridge to the future, every stone of which was paid for with the dearest price of all, the life of a brother, son, father, friend. And from that time, as long as one stone lay upon another in the refounded Belrat's foundation, the memory of the great battle, of the great sacrifice, had to live. It lived not in the bronze of pompous monuments or the solemn speeches of rulers, but in the quiet, weary sigh of a mother rocking a child under the shade of a new home, in the measured, business-like ring of a hammer in a forge open to all, in the soothing whisper of leaves in Lindorn's regenerating forests. It reminded not of glory and valor, but of the simple, terrible, iron price, of how much blood, pain, and despair had been spilled for the simplest and most natural right, the right to breathe morning air and call the earth underfoot one's free home. Velaria, the great empire of Almar, was from the very beginning something more than an alliance of peoples, bound by treaty or a shared, hard-won victory. It was a fusion of souls, woven together by bloody fate and iron necessity on the ashes of the old, divided world. Henceforth, when people spoke of the great empire of Almar, they recalled not decrees, not treaties, not even the great, hard-won victory at the walls of Belrat. They recalled what came after, quiet and inexorable as the changing seasons, that which grew on the ashes of the old, divided world, not by the will of kings, but of its own accord, like young forest breaking through thick layers of dead ash and despair. First a lone, fragile sprout, then another, until a whole thicket stood under the sky, strong-rooted and intertwined in dark earth, with a vitality tempered by death itself. Thus the empire grew, slowly, relentlessly, from the great aloe of three civilizations that could no longer, and no longer wish to, live apart. Men brought to this aloe their fire, fierce, greedy, brief, and violent as a lightning flash in a summer storm. Their lives flickered, scarcely having flared, and so in their veins ran impatient, seething blood, driving them forward with the stubbornness of a plowman first sinking a plowshare into scorched virgin soil. They did not cling to the past. Their resentments were hot but short-lived, and their gaze was fixed on the coming day, the next step, the new frontier. That very stubbornness that had not let them break at the very gates of Belrat, now turned to the stubbornness of creation. Their hands, familiar with the rough labor of warrior and farmer, now hewed stone and raised city walls that grew at a frightening, almost reckless speed. These cities thrust spires, sand-gilded spires skyward, like stone giants risen in place of yesterday's encampments. In them seethed life, bustling, loud, smoky, and prolific, knowing neither the silence of dwarven delves, nor the contemplative peace of elven groves. The most visible monument of their will were the roads, not trails beaten by hooves, but a feat of engineering, and unyielding patience, arteries straight as arrows, paved with smooth stone, binding the ends of the empire into a single living body. Along them day and night moved legions and trade caravans, messengers, and simple travelers, carrying not only silk, steel, and grain, but news, laws, the very soul of the young realm. These roads were the strongest threads, weaving disparate fates into a single, durable fabric. The elves, whose lives stretched like a long, smooth river through millennia, and whose memory held the glimmer of the first sunrise, brought to the Union not strength but knowledge, deep, quiet, rooted in the very heart of creation. Their magic was not a set of spells for taming elements, it was the art of attentive listening, a long, respectful dialogue with the world. They heard the complex song of the wind carrying tidings from distant glaciers, understood the slow, wise language of underground springs, read the world's history in the rings of ancient oaks. Their strength was the strength of harmony, of subtly weaving their own thread into the eternal pattern of being. It was the elven mages, patient as time itself, who taught others not to take, but to ask, not to conquer, but to cooperate. They showed how to draw energy not only from one's own short-lived human fury, or dwarven stubbornness, but from the eternal pulse of life around, from the sap in a blade of grass, from the warmth of a sunbeam on stone, from the quiet power of a sleeping sea. Their enchantments did not thunder or dazzle, but settled quietly as morning mist, becoming part of the thing itself. They gave stone vaults the weightlessness of a spiderweb, wooden beams the resilience of a living trunk, filled city air with the crystalline freshness of high mountain forests, and light with a soft, unwavering radiance casting no harsh shadows. Thanks to them, the empire's settlements became not mere clusters of houses, but breathing, animated creations, or every stone and every ray of light was steeped in quiet, creative magic. And the dwarves, children of deaf stone moms, displayed a different might, immovable, unshakable, stubborn as the rock itself. Born in the dark of mines, they felt veins of metal in rock strata as a fisherman feels fish underwater. Their short, muscular hands possessed strength to shatter granite, and at the same time jewelers' precision sufficient to engrave the finest pattern on a dagger blade. They did not build, they carved, hewed for eternity. From solid monoliths they raised not mere fortresses, but eternal strongholds, whose walls dozens of feet thick defied not only enemies, but time itself. In deep subterranean forges, where air trembled with the roar of hammers, and blazed with infernal heat, day and night was born not merely weaponry. Here, in fire and clangor, history was forged. Every suit of armor was a tale of its future, bare every sword, a perfectly balanced extension of a warrior's arm, holding in its tempered steel a fragment of its creator's soul. But their greatest gift was engineering genius, practical and irrepressible, when their mind, thinking in the clear laws of mechanics and unyielding logic, combined with the spiritualizing elven magic, creations previously unthinkable were born. Flying ships whose hulls were woven of enchanted wood, and the lightest dwarven aloe eternal lamps, where a spark of magic, imprisoned in crystal, banished darkness from the deepest caves and narrowest alleys. Thus the empire grew from this living, breathing aloe. Human fire found an unbreakable hearth in dwarven stone, and was guided by the bottomless, calm wisdom of the elves. Three forces, once alien, intertwined so closely one could no longer tell where one ended and another began. This unity was seen in everything. In the mirror-polished paving stones, where granite's hardness, magic guarding it from chipping, and human sweat polishing it to perfection merged in tall stained glass windows, where mathematical precision, dwarven lead frame scenes of human valor brought to life by elven art in the quiet plash of fountains and squares, whose steel hearts beat from a drop of magic can dwarven craft. And the crown of this great brotherhood was called Almerion, a city at first sight of which from a hill a traveler would halt, for it seemed a creation descended from heaven, not raised by mortal hands. Its towers, carved from stone whiter than mountain frost, soared into the azure sky with such weightless grace and crushing power. They seemed to prop up the very firmament. Silver, impossibly fine tracery, woven by elves into a tale of starbirth and the great alliance, entwined these towers like grapevines. At dawn they blazed like molten mithril, at sunset they glowed with deep, liquid gold. making the entire city shine like an unearthly sanctuary. Wide avenues, radiating like rays from the city's shining heart, were paved by dwarves for millennia. Stone slabs lay perfectly level, fitted so not even a needle could slip between. They led to spacious squares where, under the shade of trees planted by elves when the first stone was laid, a special world reigned. Here, in lacy shadow, the guttural cadences of Kuzdul, the language of trade and law, mingled with the melodious trills of Quenya, the language of poetry and wisdom. And in this blending sounded, was born, and lived the very soul of Almerion, a city where will, craft, and word fused into a new symphony. In forges where forge heat was contained by invisible elven charms, gems of unseen beauty were grown, not mined. They absorbed sunlight and starlight, channeled through complex lenses and light pipes, and, always warm to the touch, served as hearts for street lamps that flooded avenues with even, unfading light, turning night into soft, safe twilight. On stone-paved streets, beside rumbling dwarven carts and silent elven carriages, strode hippogriffs, proud creatures with eagle heads and horse bodies, tamed by a union of high magic and deep understanding of life. Their wings, tightly folded, rustled feathers as if impatient for flight. But the true wonders were the skyships. Their streamlined hulls of lightest wood, armored with filigree metal, sailed the heights, defying all familiar laws. Above them billowed invisible wind crimson sails, woven as if from frozen flame, casting trembling, scarlet reflections on the ground. Silently and majestically they glided in the blue, leaving behind only slowly dissolving trails of glittering dust. Their captains gazing down from dizzying heights upon the imperial tapestry, woven into a single fabric granite, strongholds, emerald forests, and golden fields. The greatest universities of Almerion were living, pulsing treasuries of wisdom. Their libraries delved underground like dwarven halls. And in the silence of chambers lit by eternal soft light, on shelves of dark oak stood folios whose bindings wordlessly spoke of unity. Heavy, rune-chased dwarven tomes, aside slender volumes in flowing Quenya script, while practical human chronicles in the common tongue bound them into a single narrative. In sunlit lecture halls, elven sages taught young minds to hear in the rustle of leaves echoes of the music of creation. In cool chambers, dwarf masters revealed the secrets of smithing and the silent song of the earth hidden in the heart of crystals. And in high astronomical towers, human philosophers with burning eyes taught how to comprehend time's swift river, reading the interweaving of fates in planetary motion and the flow of history. Here, in the quiet of scholarship and the ring of discovery, beat the clear, all-seeing heart of the young empire, born not of fear but of goodwill, resolved to march into the future not apart, clutching swords, but together, hand in hand. At the center rose majestically the Palace of Three Crowns. It was not a castle in the old, warlike sense, a grim, forbidding fortress gazing upon the world with mute threat. It was a city within a city, the visible embodiment and eternal symbol of that unbreakable alliance that had bound their fates forever. 3 great spires crowned it, each speaking silently but clearly of the soul of its people. The slender, refined elven spire, seeming carved not from stone but from mother of pearl and moonlight itself, its pure, soaring lines striving skyward with quiet, undeniable, ancient grace. The squat, mighty dwarven spire, built of dark, silver-veined marble, standing unshakable as the eternal mountain, its flat summit crowned not with a weather vane but a huge, faceted crystal greedily gathering daylight to emit its own soft glow at night. And the tall, proud, passionate human spire, faced with white limestone, straining upward with that fierce, almost desperate aspiration that had led their ancestors across endless, dusty plains. And all 3 different as night and day, as fire and water did not merely stand side by side. They intertwine, flowed into one another in a single, mighty, monolithic foundation, and the eye, sliding up them, saw not 3 separate, alien towers, of one inseparable whole, speaking without a single word of equality and of the titanic strength born only in genuine, blood-deep unity. In the imperial hall, under high vaults where elven artist astronomers had traced precise star charts on stone, glowing with a soft, muted light as on the clearest moonless night, sat the wisest of the wise. On a throne of living, breathing wood that had grown for ages in Lindorn's sacred grove sat the high priest Quendeler, whose face, a network of wrinkled chronicles, held the silent memory of times when the world was young and full of primal wonders. On a throne carved from solid, black as eternity granite of the dragon ranged the High King Dimran Iron Hand, whose dense beard was tightly woven with rune rings of bronze, and whose gaze from under beetling brows was hard and unyielding as the finest steel. And on a throne of white, polished marble and purest gold Empress Aliena, the Chosen, whose dynasty traced its line to the great human kings who once tamed the wild eastern wastes. And here, in this citadel of power, under the glow of eternal stars, the voice of each ruler held its unique weight, its vital, irreplaceable value. No decree, however small, no law, however severe, was considered past and true until it found living echo and deep understanding in the three hearts beating here in unison with the single rhythm of the great, young empire. The foundation, the cornerstone upon which all this man-made magnificence and social harmony rested, was not a gilded throne or the fickle will of a ruler, but the great codex. Its text was not written in ink on perishable parchment, but forever carved by the firm hand of a dwarven master carver on the surface of a giant, mirror-polished stele of dark, almost black owl, standing in the main square before the Palace of Three Crowns, in plain view of all. The metal for it was not smelted in an ordinary forge from common ore. It was smelted, reforged into a single monolith from thousands upon thousands of the sharp, razor-like claws blades of the vanquished arachnids, hewn on that very blood-soaked battlefield at Belrat. The stele itself was an eternal, visible, tangible memory of that unimaginable price the three peoples had paid for the right to have these laws, for their right to life and unity. The codex was brief, severe, and clear as a steel blow. Its first and foremost, indisputable article stated, "Before the law, all are equal, be it a high counselor in silken robes, whose single word decides the fates of whole provinces, or a simple, sweat-drenched farmer plowing his field, be he an elf whose life spans ages, a dwarf whose clan is older than many mountains, or a man whose span is brief as a lightning flash on a summer night." This equality was not a pious wish but an iron, exceptionless reality permeating every pore of imperial life, from the lowest to the shining heights. Justice was administered by the Lords Arbiters, the wisest of the wise, elected at a general assembly from the worthiest representatives of all three peoples. Their court, stern and incorruptible, took place at the very foot of that black stele, under the open, all-seeing sky, so that every citizen, from noble lord to humble water-carrier, could see and hear all that was spoken. And before their impartial, searching gaze and the scales of Themis, cast from that same dark owl, all accused, be they prince or plowman, were truly equal. Neither the nobility of an ancient line reaching back to the age of heroes, nor the antiquity of elven blood remembering the first dawns, nor heaps of gold amassed in merchant vaults, nor battle-won renown could tip the fragile scales a hair's breadth. The law was the sole and incontrovertible measure, and it was carved forever from that very metal, forged from the melted weapons of their common, vanquished foe, so that none, even 1,000 years hence, would forget it was born not of dry lust for power but of common, spilled blood and common, endured suffering. And so, in those blessed times, at the zenith of great unity, peace reigned throughout Velaria, from the snow-capped peaks of the Dragon Range to the azure, warm southern seas. Not merely absence of war, but deep, rooted peace such as exists only in the brightest, boldest dreams of poets and seers. It was almost tangible, palpable in the very air, heavy with the scent of flowering cherry orchards, the smokiness of pottery kilns, and the fragrant aroma of freshly baked, ruddy bread, under the shade of soaring white arches of Almerian, where graceful elven script intricately intertwined with angular, substantial dwarven runes. There was no single dominant sound. One heard the measured, confident ring of dwarven hammers from wide-open workshops, the harmonious, thoughtful, stream-like singing of elves reading ancient verses by marble fountains, and the loud, rolling, full-of-life laughter of men conducting lively, eager haggling in nosy markets. These sounds, so different in nature, did not drown or interrupt each other, but blended into a strange, yet astonishingly beautiful and harmonious symphony of shared, common life. Trade caravans, now drawn by strong, tamed, and docile hippogriffs, were guarded by joint, mixed patrols of peacekeepers. In such a patrol one might see a tall, stately elf with a gaze keen as an eagle's, a squat, broad-shouldered dwarf in shining polished armor, and a tall, sturdy man with a long, resilient spear on his shoulder. And under their vigilant watch, merchant wagons, loaded to the brim with exotic goods from all corners of the empire, traveled the great roads without fear or risk to the farthest, once wild and unpopulated outposts, where now rose sturdy walls of new, growing cities. Knowledge, no longer hidden as the greatest secret in secret elven chambers or dusty ancestral dwarven scrolls, flowed throughout the empire like one generous, full-flowing river. Learned men of the three peoples, forgetting old disputes, labored together over a single text, bending over one scroll or folio, while their young pupils sat at the same wooden desks, imbibing wisdom, not dividing it into ours and yours. And as mighty rivers merging at a delta form a single, powerful stream, so the hearts of Velaria's ordinary inhabitants gradually, steadily, united. Marriages between a slender elf maiden with eyes the color of spring sky and a fiery, passionate man, or between a silent, steadfast dwarf and a rosy, full-of life human daughter, or no longer a curiosity or rarity. Children born of such unions, inheriting the blood and gifts of different peoples, met not contempt or mockery in alleys, but were considered a heavenly blessing, a living, walking embodiment of the new, just world they had all built together on the ashes of the old. It seemed the very epoch, time itself, breathed peace and quiet creation. Each new day rising from behind the mountains resembled the last. Clear, serene, full of measured labor and calm, confident joy, and the future, stretching in a smooth road over the horizon, promised only new, even brighter and more cloudless dawns. The stones of cities, steeped for centuries in elven magic, seemed to glow from within with accumulated quiet happiness over long ages. And the pages of chronicles kept by wise scribes promised an endless, eternal song of prosperity and concord. And thus, under the shade of the white towers of Almerion soaring to the sky, whose stone was quarried from the deeps by dwarves, animated by quiet elven magic, and raised by untiring human hands, these three peoples created not just another state in an endless succession. They showed the astonished world something hitherto unseen. Long, serene centuries, slowly replacing that great, pivotal battle at Belrat, saw beings of different blood and fate, men, whose lives flashed like one swift, bright spark, elves, for whom those same centuries were but a chapter in a long, unhurried book, and dwarves, accustomed to measuring time by the thickness of rock strata, and the change of generations, now clan lived peacefully and calmly under the aegis and might of a single empire. They became for one another not merely forced allies, but good neighbors, faithful friends, and at times true family. The laws of the great codex seemed as unshakable as the cosmos, and the palace of three crowns an eternal, immutable symbol of unbreakable accord. But it turned out nothing is eternal under the moon, not even peace sealed by the dearest and holiest blood. Even the strongest steel forged in the crucible of shared calamity can in time acquire the thinnest, almost invisible rust of routine, indifference, and forgetting. And the hour came, quiet, gray, and unremarkable, when this seemingly eternal golden age met a sudden and absurd end. It approached not with the thunder of new battles, or the roar of monsters crawling from under the earth, but with a barely audible whisper creeping from taverns, from dark, narrow alleys, from noble salons, a whisper of old, unresolved enmity, of resentments festering in the soul's hidden corners, and of that simple, bitter as wormwood truth that any building, however beautiful and strong, begins slowly to crumble from a single, tiny crack in its seemingly monolithic foundation. First, with a dull, soul-chilling roar announcing the end of an entire era, the dwarves broke away from the great, seemingly unshakable monolith of the empire. It was not a swift, furious rebellion flaring up overnight, but a slow, inexorable, glacier-like cooling, like molten, seething steel in a cooling crucible. Their proud clans, whose ancestors had for ages kept faith with the great oath at the walls of Belrat as their chief, unbreakable sanctuary, one after another, in grim, wordless silence, began to leave the noisy, populous streets of Almerion, taking with them not only belongings, but the very soul of former unity. The cause was weighty, crushing as the blow of a war hammer on an anvil, and it came from the darkest, mute depths of the Dragon Range, from snow-covered mountain passes, through frightened traders and weary sentries, crept, like poisonous fumes, the news. In the ancient, cursed, and abandoned halls of Khazad-Gatol, the first 10 most sacred of the fallen fortresses, forges were lit again and fires danced. But this flame was not the clean, fierce, creative fire of dwarven smithies, but reeking, stinking bonfires. In the sacred halls once drenched in blood, where their kings lay in stone sarcophagi and the majestic visages of ancestors were carved in granite, hordes of goblins had made their nest. Short, vicious, scab-covered creatures, supported by dull, mighty trolls and nimble as basementrats kobolds. For the entire Dwarven people, this was not merely a military seizure of foreign territory. It was a spit upon their fathers' graves, a desecration of their very history, a mockery of the memory of the fallen. Their elders, voices trembling with suppressed rage, demanded from the Council of Three, from their allies, immediate and decisive aid to free the ancestral stronghold. They spoke of duty, of holy memory, of that very blood once mingled into a single river at the walls of Belrat, sealing their alliance. But in the shining, perfume-scented halls of Almerion, where air was heavy with the sweet smell of exotic flowers, not the acrid dust of mines, their words, heavy and simple as boulders, shattered against a smooth, polished wall of polite, cold indifference. Mired in endless court intrigues and the intricacies of the tax system, the Empress's advisors, men long forgotten the taste of real battle and the smell of real blood, merely spread their pampered hands. Their verdict, clothed in elegant, convoluted diplomatic formulas, was simple and deadly. Now is not the time for new, costly wars on remote, inhospitable borders. The Empire must strengthen peace and prosperity, not expend strength on tribal squabbles in remote mountains. For High King Dimran Ironhand, whose ancestor fell a hero in those very halls now defiled by the filthy dens of goblins, this was not merely a refusal, it was bitter, indelible betrayal. Betrayal of the very essence of the alliance. That very oath hanging on the main square on the stele cast from the owl of severed arachnid limbs. Without another word, without a glance at the extinguished faces of elves and men, he turned. And the loud, lonely clang of his iron-shod boots on marble sounded like a funeral knell for the Golden Age. And the next foggy morning, the entire Dwarven embassy, with wives, children, craftsmen, and loyal warriors, left the capital, leaving behind empty, lifeless quarters. Dimran led his people not merely home to the mountains. He left to summon all Dwarven clans under a single, iron authority, and with new, furious, desperate strength hurled themselves upon the ancient stronghold, to reclaim it in proud solitude, since former allies had forgotten the duty of honor and blood. The exodus of the dwarves from Almerion resembled neither a hasty flight nor an angry, rash assault. It was like the slow, inexorable, majestic movement of tectonic plates, an event unhurried and almost unnoticeable to the eye of a casual observer, but forever changing the very landscape of the world, its geography and its soul. When Clan Ironhand, the most influential and respected, led by Dimran himself, whose great-grandfathers had laid down their bones in the bloody hell defending Khazad-Katol, began to leave the shining white city, a heavy, unnatural silence descended. The air, usually filled with the hum of polyglot life, grew still, thick, and weighty, and even the very cobblestones of the streets, permeated with ancient elven magic, seemed to mourn in silence the great rupture of an alliance older than many current kingdoms and dynasties. They left in funereal silence, filled with grim sorrow and unshakable dignity. No clang of weapons ready for battle, no angry, accusatory speeches, no farewell cries full of longing, only the low, strained, groan-like creak of axles on heavy wagons hewn from solid centuries-old oak broke the deathly quiet of the streets. These wagons were laden not with simple belongings, but with the living history of a whole people. Wrought chests with clan runes, sacred ancestral anvils, tools of great masters whose names were legend. This was not a simple move, it was the extraction of roots that had for centuries intertwined deeply and firmly with the very foundation of the empire, now torn out, leaving behind a gaping, bleeding void. And the bitterest, most visible spectacle for those who remained were the deep scars their heavy wheels, crafted by the best Dwarven engineers for eternity, not flight, left upon Almerion's flawless, polished pavements, those very pavements, hewn from eternal grey granite by the dwarves themselves in the city's founding days, with that jewel-like fitting, where not even a razor blade could slip, were now furrowed with deep, ugly grooves like wrinkles on a face. Each was a silent, yet deafening reproach, a trace not merely of a departed people, but a bleeding wound on the very body of the city, a wound that, as every onlooker understood with cold clarity, would never heal, remaining an eternal reminder of disintegration. After Clan Ironhand, as if obeying an invisible yet imperious call of blood and stone, other great, proud clans began to stream from the city. It was a great, silent migration, like the slow, unstoppable ebbing of life from a mighty but mortally wounded body. As the soul leaves it drop by drop, the copperbeards, whose ancestors had once laid cunning aqueducts and artesian wells feeding the fountains and hanging gardens of Almerian, did not simply leave. They took with them, in carefully packed wrought chests, scrolls with blueprints and secret knowledge of waterways. All the wisdom accumulated over millennia. Soon after their departure, some fountains in the richest square spurted more weakly, as if choking, then fell silent altogether, leaving their white marble basins dry, dusty, and lifeless as empty sockets. The firebeards, in whose legendary smoky forges under the mountain the famous blades had once been forged, did not merely extinguish their forges. They emptied them to the foundation, removing and carrying on their backs the sacred anvils of special owl, remembering the hammer blows of Thormund himself. The eternal, lulling ring, the living sound of the city, vanished, and with it went the power that had birthed in fierce flame masterpieces capable of defying fate and time. With each clan departing into the mountain distance, the empire lost not merely skilled craftsmen or fearsome warriors. It lost part of its soul, part of its very essence and might. The eternal lamps, whose gems had been cut and enchanted by dwarven hands, guttered one after another, leaving once shining streets and avenues in deep, unnatural, frightening shadows. Complex mechanisms in squares, astronomical clocks showing planetary motion, self-propelled carriages froze forever, turning into useless, immobile heaps of costly metal. Bridges, for centuries protected by runic wards carved on their supports, were now defenseless before time and the elements, and in their stonework the first thin but ominous cracks appeared the next harsh winter. The empire's grandeur, seeming as unshakable as a cliff, began quietly but inexorably to crumble to dust, and the stones were the first to feel it. Dimran Ironhand, the sole surviving descendant of Thormund, whose blood was spilled at the walls of Belrhat, gathered the great council of clans in the stone halls of Naruz the Marek. The air here was thick and heavy with the smell of smoke, roasted meat, and ancient stone, and mighty vaults remembering the oaths of the first kings absorbed every sound, lending it the weight of eternity and inevitability. He stood before the gathered clan elders, gray-bearded and venerable, leaning upon the legendary two-handed axe Thunderclap, whose notched blade still bore dark stains and nicks from sliding over arachnid chitin, and the bones of the Queen Mother. His armor, in which he had once stood in the shining halls of Almerian, no longer shone like that of pampered courtiers, but was matte, covered with battle scars and the gray dust of long roads. They called us brothers, Isvos. Lowland thick as the rumble of a beginning rockslide in a deep mine, filled the vast hall without any shout, making heavy tables and copper mugs of dark, strong ale tremble faintly. When the black blood of the arachnids flooded the plains at Belrhat, and our and your forefathers died shoulder to shoulder, covering one another, they swore us eternal loyalty and friendship. When the very earth split underfoot and the creatures of the deep threatened to swallow the whole world, from mountains to sea, he paused, long and drawn out, and his gaze, burning with cold fire from under brows beetling like two stone cornices, slowly, searingly scorched everyone in the hall, from gray-bearded elders to young warriors gripping axe hafts. But now, when our cradle, our sanctuary, is defiled, when in the halls of our ancient sepulchres, where in stone coffins lies the dust of Thormund himself, wretched goblins dance by stinking fires, they turn their backs on us, their advisors, grown fat in their gilded cages, perfume and weak, say it is not the time for wars. A wrathful, swelling rumble passed through the hall, like the start of a distant rockfall deep in a mountain, first quiet, then gaining crushing force. Very well, thundered Dimran, and his words, minted in the silence, sounded like a final, irrevocable sentence. Let their empire, rotten with arrogance and lies, collapse under the weight of its own haughtiness. We return to our roots, to stone and steel. Khazad-Gatol shall be retaken. He raised Thunderclap with mighty strength over his gray head, and the notched steel gleamed ominously in the uneven light of pitched torches, casting leaping shadows on the walls. Even if we must gnaw it from the mountain's guts with claws and teeth, by our own strength, as befits true sons of stone. His last words, torn from his lips in a hoarse roar, drowned in a deafening, unanimous roar that shook the ancient vaults. Thunderclap, brought down point first onto the stone floor with force, struck a blinding shower of sparks, and that sharp, dry sound became the final period, placed upon a whole bygone era. The great council of clans was united. The long, bloody war to reclaim the ancient stronghold had begun. The what began as a furious war of liberation quickly turned into a protracted, exhausting war of attrition, an endless battle for every inch of tight stone tunnels and the approaches to the citadel. The goblins entrenched in Khazad-Gotol proved far more dangerous and cunning foes than even the most cautious and seasoned dwarven strategists had assumed. Their leader, Grizzly Crooked Heart, a lame, one-eye, milky-gazed, scab-covered old goblin whose body was a lattice of scars, turned out to be an unexpected tactical genius of underground warfare. He understood a simple truth. Against dwarven fury and iron discipline, a frontal assault was certain death for his hordes. Instead, he turned the great halls and endless, Minotaur labyrinth galleries into a deadly, ever-changing hell. He did not build, he perverted, desecrated the very essence of creation. Mechanical traps, once lovingly crafted by dwarves to protect their ancestral treasures, were rebuilt by his wretched mechanics. Now, they released not sleeping gas, but caustic, flesh and metal-eating acid, and triggered not at the entrance, but in the very heart of a dwarven formation, sowing chaos and agonizing death. Ventilation shafts that once carried fresh, clean air to lower levels now sprayed poisonous clouds of suffocating spore mold, making dwarves choke, turning blue, coughing up pieces of lawn. Poison spikes, whittled from the bones of fallen underground beasts, waited in the dark, and finally, with devilish patience, sapped supports of arch bridges collapsed under the weight of armored warriors, plunging them into black, monster-infested chasms from which only the crunch of bones was heard. The goblins used the very architecture of the underground realm against its creators. What had been an eternal monument to dwarven genius, sturdy, vaulted ceilings, hidden, precise mechanisms, multi-leveled, thoughtful structure, Grizzly turned into an instrument of slow, methodical destruction, mocking the dwarves' very heritage, making them perish in halls their ancestors had built for eternal life and glory. And if Grizzly was the brain of this underground plague, his muscles, his impenetrable shield, were the trolls. These huge, dim-witted, swamp-rot-smelling creatures with knobby skin the color of wet granite became their living, inexorable battering rams, dwarven battle axes, capable of cleaving a steel breastplate in two, rebounded from their stony hides with a dull, hopeless clang, leaving only shallow, meaningless dents, and the chief horror was their blind, untamable rage and frightening, almost magical ability to regenerate. A deep wound on a shoulder oozing thick black blood might close over with rough, scarred tissue in the time it took a dwarf to reload his heavy crossbow. Seeing a troll, seemingly maimed to death, rise with a roar shaking the walls and continue to smash their impeccable line, even the most battle-hardened dwarves, who had heard of arachnid horror, involuntarily fell back, feeling on their cheeks the icy breath of despair itself. Where the trolls' bulky bodies could not pass, kobolds held sway like poisonous insects. These small, nimble, scaly reptilian creatures became the true nervous system of the defense. They did not fight in honest combat, they cowardly, basely stung from around corners. Using their razor-sharp, clawed paws, they dug countless narrow, stinking tunnels, true catacombs within catacombs, a web of death. They emerged from under the very stone floor, from torn ventilation grates, from behind boulders, to plunge a poisoned dart into an unsuspecting sentry's neck or cut the rope of precious supplies, then vanished into the dark with a nasty hiss as if they had never been. Should a dwarven squad venture into a seemingly passable dead end, behind them, as if from nowhere, a hastily piled barricade of rubble would rise, cutting off retreat, while from above a hail of sharp stones fell on helmets and shields. The dwarves now fought not merely an enemy, they fought the very mountain, which seemed to have come alive, gained a malign will, and with poisonous hissing turned against its own creators. The dwarves suffered heavy, irreplaceable losses, a bloody burden upon their kind. Their campaign, begun with a furious, hopeful cry, turned into a slow, methodical, humiliating quagmire in their own fortress. For every reclaimed, corpse-choked hall, for every blood-drenched corridor traversed, they paid a monstrous, disproportionate price, tens and hundreds of lives of their best warriors and most experienced miners. The bitterest, most personal betrayal was that the ancient runic defense mechanisms, lovingly and carefully crafted by their ancestors to guard the eternal peace of Khazad-Gotol, were perverted by the goblins and turned against their creators. The very fortress meant to be their unbreakable shield became their trap, their collective tomb, and the once great, shining halls, where vaults were lost in subterranean height, and walls gleamed with inlays of pure gold, and the ghostly, cold sheen of mithril now presented a ghastly spectacle of mocking filth. Where altars of ancestors once held sacred fire now stood ugly, hastily molded idols of goblin deities of clay and bone, and the air, once heavy with the smell of stone dust and incense, was thick with the stench of rot, acrid smoke, and the sweetish smell of decay. As the war dragged on, becoming a bloody, hopeless stalemate, thin but dangerous cracks began to form in the once monolithic, rock-solid dwarven ranks. First a muffled, subdued grumbling, then open, heated arguments by campfires in the siege camp. Younger, less noble clans, whose roots did not reach into the hoary antiquity of Khazad-Gotol, whose current, settled homes were in other, untouched mountain ranges, began to ask questions to which Dimran and the elders no longer had convenient, soothing answers. Their patience, snapping like an over-tightened string, burst forth at the next military council of clans, in a stuffy, sweat blood and smoke-reeking tent. Thorben Copperbeard, whose clan had borne the heaviest, irreplaceable losses in the last bloody sorties, suddenly stood, shoving aside his oak mug of unfinished ale with a crash. His face, usually calm and wise, was now twisted in a grimace mixing rage and unquenchable, hard-won sorrow. Enough, his voice, ragged and hoarse as a sawn stone, cut through the hubbub. We keep throwing our best warriors, the very flower of our clans, into this accursed, insatiable meat grinder. And for what? We lose them in this fruitless siege, in these endless, dark corridors, while our present halls, our real homes, fall into disrepair. Their walls remain undefended, and the mines that feed our families unattended. He took a sharp step toward Dimran, his fist clenched in impotent wrath trembling finely. We bury our sons and daughters in the dust of foreign, however ancient, halls. We spill our blood for cold stones, while our own hearths may be extinguished any moment. This war leads us not to the glory of our ancestors, but to complete oblivion for our still living children. Dimran iron hand slowly, with effort, as if the weight of the entire mountain lay on his shoulders, rose from his bench, and everyone in the tent could see how this endless war had burned whole strata of life from him, leaving only ash and steel. In his once fiery red, dense as fern beard, like frost on a copper mine, much gray, snow-white hair had appeared during the siege months. Deep wrinkle cracks around his eyes had grown sharper, and his gaze, once hard and clear as polished adamant, now held a bottomless, animal weariness. Though when he spoke, his voice, full of hopeless despair and bitterness, still carried that same unbreakable granite will that had once made all dwarves turn their backs on Almerian and go into the mountains. Thorben speaks of our present halls, of mines, he began, and his words fell into the oppressive silence heavily and dully, like stones into a deep well. And he is right. We are losing our sons, the best of the best. We are burying our daughters, the light of our hearths. I see their pale, silent faces in every dream, every moment of forgetfulness. He paused, letting the unbearable weight of his words settle and press into every listener's consciousness. But listen to me now, and hearken to every word. Khazad-Gotol is not just a fortress of stone, built by hands. It is not just foreign halls of which it is so easy to speak, sitting by a safe hearth. He struck his chest with such force that his gauntleted hand rang loudly, martially, against the steel breastplate. It is the heart of our people, the very cavity in the breast from which our will and our pride beat. It is the cradle of our entire race, the place where our forges were first lit, and where the sacred Khuzdul first sounded in deep antiquity. It is a symbol, and that symbol is our unity, our memory, our right to call ourselves a people. His voice rose, filling with copper and steel, eclipsing for a moment even the continuous roar of the subterranean waterfall beyond the tent's canvas walls. While its halls are defiled by these creatures, while they dance on the graves of our ancestors, by their stinking fires, we are not a people. We are wretched refugees on our own land, rootless, bereft of the past, bereft of our very essence. We can build 100 new, shining fortresses, but they will be mere temporary shelters for orphans, for those who have forgotten the songs of their fathers and the names of their forefathers. But even his iron, seemingly unbending will, forged in the fiery legacy of Thorman and tempered by the bitter smoke of defeats and losses, could no longer hold the monolith cracked along all seams. Dimran's words, full of despair and rage, hung in the stifling tent air, but could no longer make tremble and contract the hearts of those who had already mourned too many and saw in this were only senseless slaughter. Clan stonecutters, whose fine craft was vital for driving new tunnels and mines, were the first to refuse, like an overloaded beam breaking. Their leaders, stubbornly avoiding Deemran's blazing gaze, declared they would send no more of their sons to the slaughter in stone sacks, from which there is no return. Their duty, they said, dryly and uncompromisingly, was to preserve knowledge for the future, not bury it with its last bearers in dusty, foreign halls. And the dwarves were forced to return to Naruz-Damerik empty-handed. That the schism did not end there, on the contrary, it only gained strength. First to leave the citadel were the stonecutters and the firebeards. Their departure was visible, palpable, to mighty roots. For centuries feeding the tree of the dwarven people, pulled themselves from the common soul and moved away toward their untouched mountain ranges, taking with them not only dwarves, but hope itself. After them, in funereal, wordless silence, other clans rose from their places, stern warriors whose ancestors had for ages guarded the richest mines of Mithril, and adamant the very lifeblood of dwarven might and wealth, declared that their duty to living generations was immeasurably more important than duty to the cold ashes of ancestors. Their departure was like a sudden rockslide, utterly blocking the main gallery of the most promising mine. The schism, like a living, creeping, inexorable crack in a granite slab, ran through all dwarven society, from top to bottom. It divided once strong families, set brother against brother, father against son, threatening to tear the nation apart forever into those who saw the only salvation in holy memory, and those who saw in it certain doom. And at this very time, in the fell, smoke-choked, wrath-stinking depths of Khazad-Katul, the ugly, grisly, crooked heart, sitting on his throne cobbled from fragments of dwarven statues, was already building new, audacious plans, not plans of defense, but blueprints for great, merciless expansion. Looking at primitive maps scrawled with soot and blood on the throne room walls, he saw not a single fortress, but a chain of under-mountain kingdoms connected by tunnels, through which his countless hordes would march. He dreamed of turning the entire underrealm, from the colossal dragon range to the remotest, wildest ridges, into his single, stinking empire, and the dwarves, weakened by internal strife, were for him merely the first, choicest, and easiest prey on this long and bloody path. With the departure of the dwarves from Almerion, a strange, unnatural, ringing peace descended upon the city. The familiar, resonant ringing of hammers vanished, the screech of saws on stone fell silent, and even the air itself seemed lighter and emptier, deprived of its accustomed, dense heaviness of coal smoke and the acrid but familiar smell of hot metal. This silence, like the calm before a storm, lasted exactly until the people, first with wariness and distrust, then with growing, irrepressible confidence, realized a simple and obvious truth. No one now contested their sole authority over the capital. What began as timid, almost reverent occupation of the empty dwarven quarters, those majestic but lifeless stone labyrinths, soon turned into an unstoppable, seething torrent of human expansion. Their natural, seething energy, like spring water breaching all dams, their astonishing fecundity and innate, insatiable thirst for growth and transformation began rapidly to change the very flesh and soul of the great city, where dwarves, with their age-old patience, raised one monumental, millennia-calculated building. Men erected 3, sometimes more, in a single short year. Pavements hewn from solid granite for eternity now cracked, and sagged under the endless load of countless, cumbersome wagons. Instead of the measured, business-like hum of dwarven workshops and the quiet conversations of elves, streets filled with deafening, ceaseless crowd noise, piercing vendor cries, loud, rolling laughter, and heated, fierce arguments in market squares. The air grew thick and dense again, but now not from the smell of ozone and stone dust, but from the aromas of food roasted on coals, human sweat, leather tanning, and smoke from thousands of new, hastily built hearths. Almerion's grandeur, once a refined alloy of 3 great cultures, began steadily to yield to purely human scale, swift, nosy, pragmatic, and unrestrained in its expansion. Almerion, once as refined as an elven poem, a work of art where every building line, every street curve was conceived for harmony and eternity, began slowly but inexorably, like a disease, to transform into something else, alien to its original essence. It was becoming a nosy, smoke-choked, never-resting human megalopolis, its heartbeat rapid, feverish, and anxious. The air, once pure and steeped in the delicate scent of elven gardens and lake freshness, was now thick, heavy, and acrid. It was filled with a choking mixture of coal smoke from thousands of new, primitive forges and craft workshops. Men, with their furious, almost obsessive zeal, lacking centuries of dwarven mastery and profound understanding of materials' very nature, tried to recreate lost technologies. Their forges blazed hotter and higher, but the steel came out brittle, with bubbles and slag inclusions. Their mechanisms were bulky and deafeningly noisy, breaking a month after construction, only to be repaired or replaced with even more massive, clumsy ones. This was not the elegant magic of alloying art and knowledge, but a fierce, almost desperate, struggle for immediate functionality, in which subtlety and grace were sacrificed to speed, and durability to quick, immediate profit. The forests that for ages had surrounded Almerion with an untouched, living ring of emerald green began slowly but surely, shuddering, to retreat under the relentless, all-crushing onslaught of human hunger. Hunger not merely for timber for buildings or space to live, but for land to conquer, to subject to the plow, and to ruthlessly parcel into plots and boundaries. Ancient trees, whose rings held living memory of the first, light steps of elves in these lands, of the quiet, magical song sung at their sacred planting, fell with a dull, death rattle crash under the ceaseless, methodical blows of dozens of axes. Their age-old, mighty trunks, once the columns of living, breathing cathedrals, now lay hewn and lifeless, yielding to neat, soulless, geometric rows of farms and lush, shadowless, mistless pastures. The landscape, a work of high art, rapidly turned into a utilitarian, primitive blueprint, understandable only to accountants and surveyors. Rivers, once flowing with crystal-clear, crystalline water mirroring the soaring white towers, were dammed with massive, crude barriers. These giant structures, though built from dwarven blueprints left behind by the departed, were utterly devoid of that quiet elven magic that for ages had maintained the water's delicate balance, ensuring its eternal flow and virgin purity. Now these rivers, constrained in stone vice, flowed sluggishly, heavily, and dirtily. Their waters, once transparent to the bottom, carried a muddy suspension of silt and poisoned, stinking affluents from thousands of new human settlements, workshops, and tanneries. Fish that had lived for ages in their cool depths, silvery, swift trout, and mighty, regal salmon now floated on the surface, showing death-white bellies, and a sweetish nauseating smell of decay mingled with the acrid smell of smoke, becoming the new, bitter, and unlovely aroma of an empire that had forgotten harmony. For the elves of Lindorn, whose lives stretched like a smooth, unhurried river through whole centuries, for whom a decade was a moment and an age a chapter in a book, this spectacle was slow, unbearable sacrilege, a torture stretched in time. They, whose ancient, quiet magic was woven into the very fabric of Almerion, into the soft light of its streets, the unbreakable strength of its bridges, the secret, breathing life of its gardens, watched with quiet, growing, soul-chilling horror as their eternal heritage was crudely, thoughtlessly, and irrevocably remade for the base, immediate needs of the short-lived, who remembered not their kinship. Each felled century-old oak was for them an agonizing amputation of part of their own collective body, each poisoned, choking river a lethal poison injected into their common, subtle veins. The high priest Quendeler, whose body seemed composed of wrinkles alone, holding secrets of bygone epochs, and of the light remaining from former times, pleaded for patience and reason, gathering elven elders around him in a shady, ivy-clad pavilion. His once resonant voice, full of unearthly strength, capable of drowning the roar of the mightiest waterfall, was now weak, fragile as the rustle of the last drying leaf on an autumn wind. But it still held a faint spark of former, unshakable hope. "They are like little children," he said, and his sorrowful words fell into the heavy, ringing silence of the gathering. Swift, nosy, and wise in their furious, blind thirst for life, they break, not knowing the true value of what they hold in their short-lived hands. But in the deepest depths of their hearts there is no innate, black malice, only blind, untamed hunger for growth, like a weed. Give them time. Let them themselves see and feel all the consequences of their own deeds. They will learn. They must, in the end, learn wisdom, else they face destruction. But even as he spoke these words, outside the pavilion's lacy windows another ancient, carved wall collapsed with a deafening, heart-rending crash to clear space for a new, crude, featureless building, and into the still garden air hung an acrid, choking trail of smoke. brazenly eclipsing the delicate scent of blooming night blooming Sirius, and the silence, heavy and hopeless, with which the elders met his words, was more eloquent and weighty than any possible objection. But his words, full of patient, almost holy hope, drowned, not reaching hearts, in the deafening, ceaseless, storm-like thunder of human activity. This all-pervasive din was everywhere. The clang of poor-quality iron, the rumble of countless wagons over cracking cobblestones, loud, hoarse voices from markets and endless constructions. For the refined elven ear, attuned to the quiet whisper of leaves and the delicate, complex music of forest streams, this deafening cacophony was not merely irritating, it was physically tortuous, wounding the soul. With each new day, the elves felt ever more acutely to physical pain, like strangers, ghosts in a city they themselves had once helped build, investing in every stone a part of their soul. Their quarters, once oases of harmony and contemplation, were now surrounded by alien, fast-growing, yeast-like structures blocking the gentle light and brazenly drowning the blessed silence. They walked familiar streets that remembered them different, pure and bright, and saw how elegant facades adorned with their fine, spider-web-like script were now hidden behind crooked wooden signs and tasteless awnings. The air, they had once filled with healing scents of herbs and night-blooming flowers, was now thick, heavy, and utterly alien. They were becoming pale ghosts in their own home, silent, powerless witnesses to how their glorious past was methodically, day by day, erased by the swift, unstoppable, soulless present, and in their immortal hearts, accustomed to ages of slow, natural change, for the first time arose a cold, aching, death-chill feeling, the bitter realization that their time here, in this place, was drawing to a joyless close, and this end, predictable and cruel, did not tarry. It was an act not merely of black ingratitude, but of deepest spiritual vandalism that echoed in every elven heart with an icy, bottomless emptiness like a grave. The decree of Empress Aliana, proclaimed to loud, triumphant fanfares and the rejoicing cries of the crowd, was that final drop that overflowed the thousand-year cup of their patience. In blind, reckless pursuit of momentary grandeur and thirst to immortalize her fleeting name in stone, she commanded the felling of the White Grove, the most ancient and sacred, living part of Almerion. These trees were not for the elves mere plants, a clump of greenery. They had been planted by the hands of the first elven settlers on that very legend-shrouded date. The first cornerstone of the future city was laid. Their roots drank living water from the same spring as the great founders. Their mighty trunks were silent witnesses to all great oaths sworn by men, elves, and dwarves. In their cool, patterned shade eternal alliances were sealed, grand plans born, and the fates of the entire continent decided. Every rustling leaf, every whimsical curl of bark was a living page in the great chronicle of the great brotherhood. They were not city ornamentation, they were its living, breathing guardians. The very memory of the alliance, its immortal soul embodied in wood, foliage, and the quiet whisper of branches. And now this living, breathing monument to their shared, hard-won history was to fall under the soulless blows of axes, to clear space for yet another cold, arrogant marble monument to mere human pride, fleeting and blind. For the elves, whose memory was as long as the river of time itself, this meant one thing. Men had not merely forgotten the past, they had consciously, with barbaric relish, decided to destroy it, to tear a page from the great book of being. For the elves, this was not merely a decree sealed with wax, nor another passing insult. It was an act of declaration of war not against their bodies or homes, but against the very essence of nature, against the memory of the world, against all they held sacred and immutable through countless sunrises and sunsets. The White Grove was not simply a collection of old trees. It was a single, living, thinking being whose quiet breath was forever woven into the city's breath, whose ancient, mighty roots held the very earth of Almerion together, preventing it from disintegrating into soulless, barren particles. To fell it meant not merely clearing a building site, it meant tearing out the still-beating heart of the city and trampling it before the eyes of those who had once breathed life into it. It was a total negation of the very connection between past and future, a final trampling of those invisible but strongest threads binding stone to wood, word to deed, sworn oath to eternity. That night in the elven quarters, usually filled with quiet music and thoughtful songs, not a single string was heard, not a single melody, only heavy, oppressive, ringing silence, more eloquent and terrible than any cries of rage or despair. And in the depth of this all-consuming silence, like a crystal in icy water, ripened the final, irrevocable, and infinitely sad decision. On one of those moonlit nights, when moonlight streamed like a ghostly silver veil, enveloping spires and straight streets in an unnatural, frozen silence, the elves left Almerion forever. They departed not in a crowd nor a solemn procession, but like shadows melting at dawn, dissolving into the very fabric of night, their light steps on the mirror-polished stone of pavements they themselves had once laid with love and knowledge made not a single sound, not a click, no angry, accusatory speeches, no cries of protest, no words of bitter curses against those blinded by their own pride, only a barely perceptible, death-sigh-like whisper of fallen leaves swirling in a silent dance under their weightless tread. They took with them not wrought chests of belongings nor priceless artifacts. They bore away something far more important and irreplaceable, their living, ancient magic, the very magic that for ages, like plowed through veins, had been woven into the city's very stones. The warm light of its street lamps, the cool freshness of its fountains, and the invisible but strong protection of its high walls. And that very night, as they departed in silence, the great city began to dim, not literally, from lack of oil in lamps, but to lose its inner radiance, its soul, its blessing. The air grew heavier, the light dimmer and more yellow, and in the very heart of Almerion, in its spiritual center, formed a yawning void, cold and silent, that could never again be filled by anything. The next morning, the inhabitants of Almerion awoke in a different, alien, and frightening city. They opened sleepy eyes and sensed the ominous change even before their minds could comprehend it. With their skin, lungs, heart, the air, usually steeped in morning freshness from the lake and the faint, magical aroma of elven night gardens, was now heavy, still, and smelled only of coal smoke and street dust. They looked out windows, rubbing their eyes, and saw with amazement that the eternal lamps, whose soft, even light never faded day or night, had guttered, leaving streets and alleys in deep blue, unnatural shadows. Fountains in main squares stood frozen, their merrily playing streams turned to lifeless, gray icicles of limestone and grime, and marble basins stood empty and dry as skulls. The great city, still full of deafening noise, bustle, and seething life just yesterday, seemed to have exhaled one last time, stilled, and turned to stone. Gone was that invisible yet palpable energy that made every stone seem alive and warm, the air crystalline and healing. Only the crude, soulless shell remained. The elves, meanwhile, without a backward glance, silently dissolved into the western, impenetrable to outsider gazes depths of the eternal forest, like raindrops in a great lake's waters. At its very edge, where once the old road of friendship had passed, they raised magical boundaries, not a wall of rough stone, but an invisible yet absolutely unbreakable barrier woven of pure will, an ancient, world-old force. Through this living barrier a bird could fly freely or a trusting beast run, but no man, driven by thirst for conquest or even simple, harmless curiosity, could find a path leading within. They did not merely leave, they severed all ties, visible and invisible, with those they now saw only as children barbarians, unwise and dangerous, leaving them alone with the cold, soulless stone of their own creations and the inexorably approaching consequences of their own blind, insatiable greed. And then began in Almerion the age of forgetting. Like a mighty, thousand-year oak that had proudly towered over a valley for centuries, it was inwardly, at its very heart, hollowed by invisible, treacherous rot. The greatest of the empire's cities began slowly, with a heavy groan, to lean toward its inevitable decline. It was a slow, almost ceremonial, bitterly ironic fall, in every gesture of which one could read the despair of former, unshakable grandeur. Without the rough but virtuoso skillful dwarven hands, that knew all the secret lore of stone and metal, bridges began to sag on their supports, and carved, filigree facades became veined with fine, then deep cracks that no one and nothing could mend. Without the quiet elven breath that for ages had woven living magic into the world's very flesh and soul, stone became merely stone cold, mute, lifeless, and gradually, day by day, turning to dust under wind and rain. Almerion, deprived of its living roots and immortal soul, began slowly but surely to die. Its vital force, that which made fountains spout crystalline streams and eternal lamps shine with an even, warm light, ebbed away, slipping through the fingers of bewildered citizens like water in the sand of a dried-up river, leaving behind only cracked, barren, dead clay. Bridges that once, illumined by runic power, seemed to float over waters lighter than morning spiderwebs, now groaned under the weight of accumulated years and general neglect. Their white stone, once seeming carved from moonlight itself, became marred with ugly scars and dark stains. Creeps, like wrinkles on the face of a dying king, crawled ever wider, and every passage over them, from cart to lone rider, echoed in the silence with a dull, visceral groan foretelling inevitable, thunderous collapse. Men, the remaining, bewildered rulers of a crumbling heritage, rushed about in futile, frantic attempts to patch the gaping, bleeding wounds of empire. Their alchemists, having exchanged the reverent silence of elven libraries for smoky, sulfur and acid-reeking laboratories, brewed murky potions and abrasive mixtures to cleanse the waters day and night, that the rivers, deprived of magical balance and life-giving force, continued to carry their turbid, rusty and alkaline streams, in whose murky depths only occasionally, like pale ghosts, flashed dead, belly-up fish. Engineers, unaware of the dwarves' pedantic, mathematical precision and lacking their intuitive, almost mystical understanding of mechanics, built new, cumbersome mechanisms to replace the frozen ones. These creations were clumsy, ugly, belching acrid coal smoke and breaking at the first serious strain, like clay toes. Their deafening, monotonous roar drowned the city's last pitiable hum, that they could not even remotely replace the quiet, eternal, confident thrum of former, living creations, self-taught mages, whose art was a pale, distorted parody, a wretched shadow of former elven might, muttered incoherent incantations afore cracked walls, trying to recreate lost protective charms, that their makeshift rituals did not animate stone, they only left sooty, ugly scorch marks upon it. Their weak, untamed power did not weave into reality's fabric but merely scratched its surface, causing pain and accelerating decay. All their desperate, feverish efforts were like vain attempts to plug with a finger, even a palm, a breach in an old, decrepit dam from which dozens of powerful, untamable streams already gushed. For every one patched, crudely cemented crack, 2 new ones appeared, and the heavy, measured tread of inexorable decline grew ever louder and clearer, utterly drowning their fussy, impotent activity. Aqueducts, deprived of the gentle but mighty elven magic that for ages, like blood through veins, had maintained in the water's crystalline purity and mountain spring freshness, now brought into homes a turbid, brownish tinged liquid with a distinct, nasty aftertaste of rusty iron and deep, swampy decay. People drank it, grimacing and spitting, and cooked their meager food with it, feeling the very essence of rot and disintegration seep into their sustenance. New constructions, hastily erected from rough, crumbling stone and raw, dark, already mold-touched wood, hung like ugly, hideous excrescences on the elegant, mathematically precise facades of the glorious past. They did not merely spoil the view, they were tasteless, garish monuments to swift, shameful decline, a malicious mockery of the very memory of former harmony. With their coarse, angular, absurd forms they desecrated the very beauty that had once, in the days of the Empire's youth and strength, made hearts sing with delight at a mere glance. Now that glance evoked in the remaining citizens only a heavy, hopeless sigh and aching pain for the irretrievably lost. The Empire of Almar, whose vast domains had but yesterday stretched from the snow-capped peaks of the Dragon Range to the azure, endless expanses of the southern seas, began to crack at every seam like sun-baked clay. It became like a magnificent but abandoned ship, left in a stormy sea without rudder or sails, its once mighty hull unable to withstand the pressure of leaden waves, and beginning with a crash to split along old, rotten fastenings. Great trade routes, that for centuries had bound the entire continent into a single economic and cultural whole, like golden arteries, were ruthlessly cut. Bandit gangs infested them. Gold, knowledge, and hope itself, all that had made the Empire a living, breathing organism, ceased to flow through Velaria's veins, leaving behind only trackless wilderness, poverty, and universal, rust-like distrust. The Palace of 3 Crowns, once the beating heart of the entire empire, where fates of the continent were decided at one table, now stood deserted, abandoned, and silent as a tomb. Its high vaults, remembering the wise, measured speeches of Quendalor, the thunderous, furious disputes of Dimran, and the prophecies of the first emperors, now echoed only with the howls of the cold north wind wandering through empty, dusty galleries and collecting in corners dry leaves and age-old dust. Empress Aliana, whose name was once uttered with trembling and hope from one ocean to the other, spent long, endless days in bitter, inexpressible solitude eating into her bones. She sat on the cold as ice marble step at the very foot of her great throne, gazing with empty, weary eyes at the vast, vacant throne hall. Here, in the slanting, dusty rays of the dying sun piercing shattered, once gleaming stained glass windows, shadows of former might, echoes of long ago speeches, ghosts of nosy feasts dance their mute, ironic, infinitely mocking dance of oblivion. Her advisors, courtiers, and flatterers, those very ones who had once showered her with flattery and sworn eternal loyalty, all had scattered like rats sensing the near and inevitable death of a sinking ship. And in the center of the main square, before the silent, orphan palace, stood, like a reproach, the great codex. That very monolith of vanquished arachnid limbs that had once guaranteed equal rights to all races, and was the visible, unbreakable symbol of the Great Alliance. Now it was merely a useless, forgotten by all block of tarnished, almost black metal, from shoulder to base split by a deep, gaping, wound-like crack, more eloquent and terrible than any, even the bitterest, words. On the eastern borders, once securely covered by the unassailable might of imperial legions, orc patrols were now seen ever more often. They, sensing weakness and the smell of rotting flesh, crawled from their steps like flocks of hungry vultures, attacking frontier villages left without any protection, driving off meager livestock and defenseless people. The dwarves, locked in their impregnable mountain strongholds, as if buried alive in the stone crypts of their own former greatness, wage endless and furious, almost hopeless wars. These wars raged not under the life-giving sun, but in the stifling, close dark of subterranean halls, where the only light was the crimson glare of furious forges, and blinding sparks from blows of tempered steel on chitinous carapace, their famed cleavers and heavy shields, on which one could still with difficulty make out the glorious, faded runes of former times, were stained not with scarlet human blood nor light, moon-like elven blood, but the black, disgustingly stinking blood of goblins and the sticky, corrosive, metal-eating ichor of trolls. This was not war for glory or new lands, but desperate, bloody, last-breath slaughter for every inch of native, sacred stone, for every hull lovingly carved by their great ancestors. Memory of Khazad-Gatol, of their defiled cradle, burned their stony hearts like a red-hot coal laid on a palm. It fed their rage, gave strength for each new blow. But that same memory filled their souls with such bottomless, mute sorrow that the surface world with its forests, rivers, and petty human strife seemed to them distant, alien, and unworthy of even fleeting attention. This eternal, unhealable pain cut them off from the surface world more firmly and surely than any highest mountain ranges. They fought in complete, proud solitude, in utter, oppressive darkness, and the deaf echo of their lonely battle no longer reached those who at once, in a distant past, been called their brothers, the elves of Undorn, sheltering in the depths of the eternal forest like a shell snapped shut at the touch of a rough, barbaric hand, withdrew finally and irrevocably into themselves, into their thoughts and their sorrow. Their magic, once generously shared with the world, turned to the warm light of Almarion's lamps and the crystalline freshness of its waters, now contracted, concentrated, and turned inward, upon self-preservation. It raised around their domains impenetrable, invisible boundaries, not walls of stone, but living barriers of pure will and ancient, forgotten song, through which no mortal could pass, be he a desperate adventurer or a merely lost, unfortunate traveler. They became silent, stern guardians of dying nature, the last keepers of the world as it was before men, in its primal purity and harmony, with cold, all-understanding, all-forgiving sorrow in their immortal hearts. They gazed from the very farthest edge eastward, whence came the muffled but continuous hum of human strife. They saw how the children barbarians on the ruins of their common home, in the shadow of ruins they themselves had created, with unyielding, almost animal stubbornness, continued to dig the earth. That they dug not foundations for new cities, but narrow, deep, and dark pits. The great empire of Almar had fallen, not physically, trying to maintain visible outlines of former order, but spiritually. Its golden age, once shining brighter than the sun, had sunk into the abyss, turning first into a vague legend, then a beautiful fairy tale lulling children by the heart. And for many, born already in a world of shadows and fragments, becoming altogether an impossible fiction, too beautiful and pure to be truth. Its legacy was like inextinguishable embers smoldering under a layer of cold ash, already cooled on top to a gray, lifeless crust, but still holding within a fiery, living core. Memory smoldered of it in long nights, when old dwarves, whose beards were white as mountain lion, sat on roughly hewn benches by a dying forge. The heat subsided, and darkness thickened in the corners of the smoky smithy, but their low, cracked voices, like the creak of unlubricated millstones, animated in the semi-darkness other shapes. They told their grandchildren, whose eyes gleamed in the amber's glow, not of ore or blade forging. They recalled the straight, arrow-like whiteness of the roads of Almar, stretching to the horizon, and the ringing hum of hammers beating in time with some elven chant. They spoke quietly, haltingly, as if afraid to scare away the very ghost of that time. It smoldered in abandoned halls where a scholar's foot had not trod for many years. In libraries where once reverent silence reigned, heavy with the smell of old parchment and lamp oil, now only dust floated, and drafts whizzing through corridors with broken windows rustled pages as if sighing. Yellowed scrolls, cobwebbed, lay in disorder, and lines inscribed in runic Kuzdul, flowing Quenya, and the simple common tongue merged into a silent choir. They screamed of laws, of poems, of blueprints for machines that sailed the skies, screamed so loudly in their silence that ears rang from the soundlessness. It was the cry of former harmony, now torn, like the parchment itself, crumbling in the wind. It smoldered in the most ancient forests that remembered the world before the first roads. There, where shadows were longer and silence deeper, in the very heart of dense thickets, a sensation still lived. It lurked in the barely audible whisper of foliage, in the velvet moss on the north side of stones, in the quiet babble of a stream untouched by dams, living roots of ancient trees, delving into damp, fertile soil, still remembered the warmth of elven palms touching bark in a gesture of blessing, and the distinct, fierce firmness of dwarven sandals, steadily tramping paths in the time when those paths were common. The forest kept this memory in its annual rings, layer upon layer, like a chronicle of lost trust. And somewhere in the world's most hidden depths, beyond the petty whirl of small kingdoms with their wretched strife and ephemeral, moth-like wars, behind the silent walls of elven sanctuaries, shielded by thicket and sorrow, and behind the granite gates of dwarven strongholds, closed upon themselves and their stubborn silence, there glimmered hope, not bright, not flaming like the banners of old campaigns, but quiet, concealed, hidden in the very heart, like the most precious and most fragile gem, yet stubborn. Stubborn as a rock on which nothing grows, but which stands, unshakable, under the blows of millennia of rain and the fiercest frosts. It was stronger than the fear that drove the elves into their forests, and heavier than the sharpest memory of betrayals and wounding words spoken in the heat of strife. It was the hope that a day would come, a day when from the very heart of the coming darkness, from that blackness that devours sun, stars, and meaning itself, a new threat would rise. Not predatory neighbors, not hungry hordes, but something all-consuming that would leave not one stone upon another, neither of elven groves, nor dwarven fortresses, nor human cities. And then, in that last, darkest hour, the three peoples, wounded by mutual grievances, tormented by their own losses and the bitter experience of disunity, would again, as once, long ago, when the world was younger and hearts bolder, hear, through the deafening, mad roar of approaching battle, through the sorrowful rustle of falling leaves foretelling doom, through the weeping of children and the moans of the wounded, they would discern a distant, barely perceptible sound, an echo, that very echo of the ancient oath sworn at the smoking, blood-drenched walls of Belrat, where their ancestors, shoulder to shoulder, unflinching, met the end of all they knew, to give life to that of which they had only dared to dream. And, hearing that echo, through the fog of ages and the weight of all lived years, they would finally remember, not glory, not triumph, not the gleam of Almarion's white towers. They would remember the price, the true, indivisible, terrible price of that unity. Remember, and perhaps the hand clutching a sword would tremble, then find and clasp another hand, even one belonging to one they still yesterday called a stranger. For the darkness that comes does not distinguish between peoples. It devours all, and only memory of the light that was can kindle the light that must be. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.